Welcome to the final installment of the series ranking the power of characters based on lore. Once again, we will be focusing entirely on the NPCs of the game, from phantoms, characters, vendors, invaders, and more, and excluding any character that is a boss NPC hybrid, as that was the subject for the other series. You'll notice the first few weakest characters on this list are basically all as weak as each other, and the distinction was purely made on how overtly powerless they are rather than their clear influence in the game. So keep that in mind for the first few entries that include firekeepers and beings who are disabled in various ways. In many senses, they could all be placed at the same rank, but that would disrupt the flow of the video. Regardless, they give us crucial insight into the other entries, so it's important they remain. Just like the other video, I'll exclude most meta-narrative beings such as the Painter, just as we did for the Primordial Serpents in the first list, as their power is infinitely difficult to assess and their role in the universe outside the comparative confines for the rest of the game. Before we start, I would say I rely entirely on organic growth. I write, narrate, and even edit my videos by myself, and the small gestures to the algorithm gods go a long way. So please, I respect every single one of you that like or subscribe to my channel and videos. But without further ado, let's get into the first entry. As the only Lord of Cinder on this list, Ludlith of Courland is very far from the being he was when he linked the First Flame. We learn Ludlith is a pygmy lord, and thus one of the first primordial humans to be crowned by Gwyn as Lords of the Age of Fire and branded with the dark sign for his descendants to bear. In a similar sense, Ludlith, as one of these pygmy lords, believed more than anyone else the ritual of linking the First Flame and preserving the unnatural cycle set off by Gwyn, leading eventually to Ludlith himself taking the mantle as a Lord of Cinder and incinerating himself to preserve the Age of Fire. The act of rekindling the flame would affect Ludlith more than any other previous lord, and we aren't told exactly why this is, but it may relate to his possession of a large aspect of the Dark Soul due to being born a pygmy of the Dark Soul itself. In his contemporary form, he has been rendered entirely disabled, frail, and still traumatized by the events of rekindling the First Flame, yet he continues to espouse the linking of the First Flame and is the only one of the 4 rebirth Lords of Cinder to accept this role in linking the First Flame for the second time, voluntarily bringing himself to the Firelink Shrine, ready to sacrifice himself once again. Unfortunately for Ludlith, in his contemporary form he harbours very little power, but clues from his dialogue, but also his unique ability to transpose souls, indicate he may have stood firmly in the sorcery tradition. We learn Courland, his land of origins, would be famous for the use of crystal kilns and transposing souls with them. This, combined with the frame of his character, fits the archetype of a mage, but in reality we aren't given any clues outside of this, nor the power utilised by Courland in its own military forces. Ludlith the Traumatized and Incinerated ranks firmly as the weakest character in the game. In the list for Dark Souls 1, we spoke about Carim in relation to Lautrec's story. During this period, we discovered that Carim was specifically different to other regions in Lordran. It was a land of many gods with no great affiliation to the Age of Fire. We learn from Oswald and Lautrec that Carim had a diversity of religious beliefs. We know many worshippers would rise in Carim, often associated with gods who once belonged to Gwyn's Anor Londo bureaucracy. We know directly of Velka and Fina having great influence in this territory, despite being shunned by the same establishment that once authorized their godhood. However, context from the third installment outlines a huge shift in the international theological structure of the game. While initially Thorolund under Lloyd's tutelage was at the height of this structure, we learn from Lloyd's shield ring that much time has passed since the worship of Lloyd. The clerics of Carim had always strongly asserted that Lloyd was a derivative fraud. This clear change in narrative around Lloyd's divine presence suggests Thorolund and thus Lloyd had their great influence diminished over time, and Carim was now a much greater body of religious authority in the prevailing narrative of the game. But if Karim hosted great antithetical forces such as that of Velka and the traitor of the Age of Fire Fina as gods, how has Karim hijacked this authority? Well, we learn from the Karim Braille tome that Karim has changed. No longer does Fina or Velka or other pagan gods demand influence. Rather, it's now the face of Gwyn that has embedded itself in Karim's culture. We even know the Way of the White and even the Paladin tradition has since moved away from Thoroland and found its way into Karim. Karim was now a hybridization of Thoroland's theocracy and Karim's more liberal and unorthodox means of practicing religion. The integration of Karim and Thoroland's culture is best represented in the description and popular view of Thoroland's famous symbolic rings. The rings once associated to Lloyd and representative of Thoroland's harsh penal system have become redundant. The description of the ring tells us, while still circulated, were no more than antiques of Lloyd's old conservatism. The Lloyd rings bearing imagery of swords and shields were now symbolically redundant. The people of Karim and thus Thoroland no longer had to worry about the sword of the law when it came to practicing religion. In the same sense, the Way of the White, now unbound by the harsh theocracy at the heart of Lloyd's nation, were now reformed for the better. Holy figures were no longer great high priests born into nepotism, but many common holy women with a passion for divinity now represented the tradition. Naturally, not everything swung in Karim's way, as Karim too would change due to this integration. We learned Thoroland's rigid paladin class would become prevalent in Karim too. The tone once set by the great Leroy now represented itself as Knights of Morn, dutied with the preservation of holy women. While the story of Karim's paladin class is for Egon's entry, we know Irina sat firmly within what we know of Karim's holy women. While those who were blind may have been shunned by the rigid theocracy of Thoroland, Karim embraced blindness and even made tomes built for blind clergymen. We can assume this was the case due to Morn's influence as a great medium between both cultures, as he not only represented the power of Thoroland's warrior class of clerics, but also accepted a deity known as Cather, who sat as a holy figure, but held within her a darkness antithetical to this, making room for a great class of holy women who may have been inherently flawed or representing the antithetical dark soul, but now viewed as worthy of proving themselves in redemption. Irina would climb the Karim theological structure and even be renowned a saint. We learn from the saint's ring in which she wears that in Karim the saints give voice to the ancient tales. They memorize countless cumbersome sacred books, a function in which they are widely renowned. We aren't told why Irina would leave Karim, but we know both Karim and specifically Thoroland had great space for pilgrimages. We also know within Irina was the soul of a budding firekeeper. Firekeeper souls were often touted as inherently dark and volatile. Thus, she may have seen her pilgrimage to Lothric as an ultimate means of amending for her soul and projecting it into a divine duty. However, all this being said, even Irina's ashes describe her as a frail being. While she has a great grasp over miracles, we know all of these miracles are of healing. She doesn't even have a spell such as Wrath of the Gods that would be typical of a saint of Thoroland. She relies entirely on her assigned paladin Egon, and ultimately ranks as one of the weakest characters in this game, while helping us contextualize quite well the story of contemporary Karim. With the exception of the Dark Moon Knightess, Firekeepers in the game have consistently been positioned as beings of great sacrifice, often frail and unable to defend themselves from antagonistic forces. We learn in Dark Souls the bonfires of the world linked intimately with the First Flame require the use of souls to keep the flame lit and the restorative properties maintained. It's easy to thus explain bonfires as beacons likely erected by the powers associated to the Age of Fire to beckon humans to the ultimate goal of linking the First Flame. This is why a great majority of Firekeepers are associated to the linking of the First Flame, just as is the case for our Firekeeper in question. However, unlike most Firekeepers and most like the enigmatic Emerald Herald, the Firekeeper of Dark Souls 3 is incredibly mysterious. We have absolutely no clue as to where she comes from, only that she, much like the others of the Firelink Shrine, are duty-bound to upkeep the shrine and maintain the journey of Ashen Ones looking to link the First Flame. We know the firekeeping tradition in its more traditional sense is still maintained in the game, as Irina, a saint of Kareem, looks to become a firekeeper through the rite of a pilgrimage, something we can assume the firekeeper we meet has already gone through. We also learn blindness has become a somewhat prerequisite for most firekeepers in the contemporary age. This may allude to the idea that most firekeepers are of the dark soul and thus innately human, as we learn the best means of powering a fire is to feed it humanity, a portion of the dark soul itself. Being blinded would fill the firekeeper's sight with darkness, suggesting a closer affinity to their own innate darkness and thus a closer relationship to their own humanity and the ability to project this towards the first flame. The firekeeper set tells us the firekeepers were robbed of light to better serve as vessels for souls. Only those who cherished the writhing, searing darkness were given the keeper's black attire. The most conclusive reason as to why they are blind may actually be related to the fact that the world as we know it in Dark Souls 3 has seen so many cycles that the Age of Fire's unnatural stagnation of the world has caused the world to become a living contradiction of the thesis once espoused by Gwyn, and thus if the firekeepers retain their eyes, seeing the world in its current state would have them lose faith in the Age of Fire and thus betray their purpose. This is precisely why the description of the eyes of a firekeeper tells us it reveals to the sightless firekeepers things that they should never see. Ludlith gives us more context about the eyes, telling us these eyes might reveal to the eyeless firekeepers scenes of betrayal, things never intended for her kin, visions of the age's end. A further testament to how Gwyn systematically used the ideological apparatus of the Age of Fire to take advantage of humans in sacrificing themselves to a cause antithetical to the core of their being, literally blinding them to the reality of these contradictions, something made most apparent during the era of Dark Souls 3. We know the Firekeeper is essential in the endings of the game, relating to each ending in a different way, but ultimately her power does not extend outside of aiding our actions. If we grant her eyes, she sees the world and accepts the reality of the Age of Fire ending. If not, she continues the cycle, carrying on the burden that's always been associated to the Firekeeper since the beginning of time. All in all, while the Firekeeper is distinct to all other Firekeepers in the game, in a sense she ends the tragic stories of Firekeepers altogether. While initially she is a well-meaning maiden used as a tortured sacrifice to Gwyn's twisted pursuit of preserving the first flame and thus representing the ordinary tradition, she can be granted the eyes and souls of other Firekeepers since past and be granted an escape from the cycle of abuse her kin have endured, allowing us to subvert the cycle of tyranny, but also end it altogether in the usurpation of fire ending. Outside of this, she has very little in strength. She is intentionally submissive to our cause, regardless of how we pursue our goals, ultimately ranking above Ludlith as he is, well, decrepit and chronically in pain. As what is likely the first vendor NPC we meet in the game, the Shrine Handmaiden is a warm welcome to those who have played Dark Souls 2, as her appearance seems to indicate a relation to the old Firekeepers from that game. We learned from Dark Souls 2 that the old Firekeepers were once fully fledged Firekeepers who looked over a fire connected to the first flame. We learned they are now retired and thus took to adorn red robes to indicate their past duties. While we can't say for certain if this Firekeeper is related to the old Firekeepers of Dark Souls 2, we do know her story and lineage firmly place her within the more contemporary events of Dark Souls 3. We know this because of her relation to Cirrus and context she gives us upon Hodrick's own storyline. There are references to Cirrus as her granddaughter, and the sly detail of certain items such as the budding green blossom, suggesting the Shrine Handmaid was her dear grandmother and Hodrick her grandfather, suggesting both were in a relationship. We know Hodrick and his family had a deep connection to the Darkmoon Covenant, and thus the bureaucracy of Anor Londo and the tradition of preserving the First Flame. And much like Hodrick's previous role in the Darkmoon Covenant, which is something we'll detail more in his respective entry, the Shrine Handmaiden may have been too associated to the Age of Fire, and thus her efforts were translated through the tradition of maintaining the fire as a firekeeper. We learn from the Shrine Handmaid that she cannot be truly killed as she harbours a curse tying her to the First Flame, which gives us insight into why the Firekeepers in Dark Souls 2 died laughing, as they too knew their lives would never expire so long as the First Flame maintained their curse. A curse we don't hear a lot about, but may be connected to the vows associated to humans preserving the First Flame. The primary function of the Shrine Handmaid is purely based around the other Ashen Ones. She can sell us wares based on the death of certain figures, but can also find use of ashes related to a dead Ashen One and transfer their items to her sellable wares. As a character, she doesn't fight back and appears to be entirely chairbound. She doesn't have any specific spells or weaponry, and even her acquisition of items don't appear to be one of a sly merchant traversing treacherous grounds, rather through relationships with other Ashen Ones in the Firelink Shrine. Something we know is the case, as she can speak to us as one of many and spouts dialogue that seems like a generic welcome given 100 times over. For this reason, the Shrine Handmaid ranks here on the list, her story remaining a great succession to some of the questions around the Firekeepers from Dark Souls 2, but also the nature of Cyrus's timeline in the world, placing above the Firekeeper as she isn't blind and entirely subservient to our will, often snapping back when contested. Yoel of Londor is tied intimately with the story surrounding the Sable Church and Uria's mission to bring upon an Age of Hollows. Yoel himself comes from a tradition of beings known as pilgrims. We learn pilgrims are all from Londor, the land of Hollows, governed by the Sable Church. While I'll leave the story for the Sable Church for Uria's entry, what is relevant here is that the Sable Church was prided as a nation that celebrated Hollows not as mindless zombies, but a true reflection of humans, and thus the state of Londor was to be diametrically opposed to Lothric and the Age of Fire entirely. Londor was a nation steeped in strengths, bringing to life historically antithetical forces and formalizing them within their walls. They reinvigorated hexes associated to Novlan and Gilea, brought the art of life drain and the Dark Hand back into use since its hiatus during Dark Souls 2, and notably had been co-signed by none other than the most historical ally to the revolutionary forces of the Dark itself, this being Darkstalker Karth. There are a variety of beings that hail from Londor. We have the Pale Shade Assassins, the Founding Sisters, but we also have the Pilgrims. Our biggest clue as to who the Pilgrims are actually come in two forms. The first is the initial dialogue given to us by Yoel, who indicates their goal is to travel to Lothric and die. The second comes from certain twig-winged angels we can witness during the boss fight with the Dragonslayer armor, but also in the Ringed City. It's heavily inferred the pilgrims would travel to Lothric on a, well, pilgrimage, and upon their journey's end be granted death only to be reborn as an angelic being, no doubt to further Londor's presence in Lothric. Yoel, however, remarks that he is surprised he didn't die, but our presence assures him that his journey's end is not fulfilled until he has aided us on our own journey towards becoming a Lord of Hollows, thus triggering the Age of Hollows main storyline. Interestingly, Yoel is the only character that can make use of the Dark Sigils and further our own hollowing, giving us insight into how Hollows were able to retain their individuality in Londor, as with the use of the Dark Sigil, their humanity was able to retain itself despite the Dark Sign. Unfortunately, the power associated with Yoel sort of just ends here. As a combatant, he is entirely redundant, and while he can teach us soul sorcery such as Soul Greatsword, he doesn't ever cast any of these spells, rather just takes our beating. But as we have loads of super weak non-combative characters, we have to stretch that his lore does indicate he was a sorcerer with the ability to cast offensive spells, and may have chosen against using them against us, as we were far more important to the cause than even his life, and it's for this reason Yoel of Londor ranks here on the list. Emma's story sits firmly within a lot of context around the upcoming entries for Camaway and Gothard, but what is important to note here is her background, so we can use this to gauge her strength. Not unlike the Shrine Handmaiden, Emma is clearly a woman quite far past her prime. We learn she was something of a wet nurse to the twin princes, likely during Osiris's tenure as the ruler of Lothric. On our first encounter, she clearly wards us away from the twin princes, not for protection, but rather to ensure that if she is to grant us passage to Lothric, we are for certain an Ashen One looking to rekindle the first flame. Why she holds this belief is likely related to her role as a high priestess of Old Lothric under Osiris. We learn Lothric itself is a nation that prided itself as propagators of the tradition of linking the first flame. We learn Osiris would also go as far as to groom his own heirs to become fire fodder for the first flame and eventually spiral into madness after his chosen son was born deformed and seemingly unable to link the first flame on his own. After Osiris's self-imposed exile, we learn Emma maintained Osiris's and therefore the nation of Lothric's belief of pushing to maintain the first flame and the tradition of fire-linking. Her initial skepticism of granting us passage may be related to her story with the moving forces of Sullivan, as she wants to make sure we are here to link the first flame rather than to push Sullivan's agenda of stagnating the fire-linking cycle. This is why only once we have obtained the souls of the Lord of Cinders does she grant us passage, telling us, "Prince Lothric is in your hands, please save his soul. Tell him what he must be, a lord." And as we learn, the twin princes have since accepted the stagnation of the cycle, likely at the manipulation of Sullivan. Emma knew the only chance to turn the tides back in favour of linking the first flame was through us, a being that now held the capacity to either take it into our own hands or have the power to convince the twin princes to reassume their role as chosen firelinkers. Emma, however, was no powerhouse in herself. We learn she was assigned various guards from the section of Lothric, still under the belief that they could push for the linking of the first flame. We know there are guards outside her wall, phantoms such as that of Albert, and even through some context, Gothard assigned to preserve her life and push her agenda. Camaway's entry later in the list even suggests the twin princes knew of Emma's actions and even sent a warrior of the Black Hand tradition to stop Emma. We learn Camaway's weapon, known as Obidachi and Onikiri, loosely translates to Old Woman Slayer, further solidifying this connection with the added context of Camaway eventually killing Gothard too. While Emma lives up to some degree of her divine role, able to teleport us and even speak telepathically, she doesn't host any offensive spells, she doesn't use miracles, and relies entirely on a cohort of warriors to maintain her life. It's for this reason she ranks here, higher than the Shrine Handmaiden, as it's clear within her character are unique divine powers that may host some offensive capabilities, whereas the Shrine Handmaiden has none. The Corvian Settler is a non-hostile character that resides in the painted world of Ariandel, while the story of Ariandel, as we learn, would be a separate plane of existence that almost sat as a microcosm of the real world. Within Ariandel, they too were suffering from a stagnating cycle. This cycle, however, was one that was plagued by a perpetual rotting of the world, not dissimilar to the ashes accumulating in the real world. The Corvian Settler in this parallel universe resembled the victims of this perpetual cycle, not unlike the Hollows of our world. We learn the majority of the population associated with the Painted Worlds were the followers of Velka, resembling majestic crows. However, their majesty has thus been eroded by a progressing rot, a rot seemingly perpetuated by Father Ariandel, flaying himself to prevent the fire from encouraging a new cycle, one that did away with the rot to begin anew. This of course resembles Gwyn's forceful measures and self-sacrifice to stop the Age of Dark undoing the Age of Fire and implanting the curse of hollowing to humans to force others into linking the first flame and therefore subverting the Age of Dark. The Corvian Settler pleads for the flame to undo the rot in the world in a similar plight to those of the Abyss, wishing for a world outside of the curse forced upon them by Gwyn's unnatural preservation of the Age of Fire. In this sense, the Corvian Settler is a facsimile of the Hollows. While we know Hollows in the main universe are much more complex, with stories of Londor propping up Hollows as a symbol of struggle and power in the face of the Age of Fire's dwindling and ashen state, the Corvians are clearly representative of the Hollows from the first ages of the series, broken, mutated remnants of their former selves. In this, the Corvian Settler is one of the weaker characters on this list, ranking above entirely frail beings due to the fact that we can witness a few Corvians fighting us with scythes and daggers, suggesting they still hosted some of the power of crow demons and the traditions once propped by Velka. However, the dagger does tell us behind this desperate fighting style reveals much about its owner's fears, ultimately ranking the Corvian Settler here on the list. Rosaria is an interesting character, as on our first encounter it appears she is an entity of the dark, as she is malformed and has an entire covenant devoted to invading other players as Red Phantoms, including that of Kirk, who has a prolific history as a Dark Wraith. However, upon receiving her soul, if we trade it in for transposition with Ludlith, we are granted the Bountiful Sunlight spell, a spell described as a miracle of Guinevere, tying her to the Anor Londo ruling bureaucracy. We learn from the Sun Princess ring that Guinevere left her home with a great many of other deities and became a wife and a mother, raising several heavenly children, suggesting Rosaria, a divine being in her own right, was one of Guinevere's children, and thus her soul linked directly to a miracle created by Guinevere herself. However, further context is given when we look at a few items, including the Divine Blessing item, suggesting Rosaria may have her story pitted in a completely different place to the place where we find her. We are told the unnamed Queen of Lothric was a goddess of bounty and fertility, not unlike Guinevere, suggesting Rosaria is likely one of Guinevere's heavenly offspring. It puts her geographically but also contextually in the same spot associated to the Queen of Lothric. So what explains her complete divergence from her royal duties in Lothric? Well, we're told from the description of the Divine Blessing that one day the Queen of Lothric would disappear shortly after the birth of Ocelot, youngest of Osiris's bloodline. We aren't given any context as to how or why she disappeared, but if we venture through the Grand Archives, we can find a peculiar cage with a spell named the Divine Pillars of Light. It tells us, the Queen's holy maiden Gertrude was visited by an angel who revealed this tale to her. Despite losing both her sight and her voice, she was determined to record the tale. We learn further context from the Winged Knight armor set that tells us the gospel of this so-called angel would find influence within Lothric, and Lothric would firmly stand against it as heresy to the order of the kingdom. With the context that Gertrude was second only to the Queen of Lothric and her personal maiden, we can assume Gertrude may have spread the gospel to the Queen of Lothric herself, something that the Queen may have taken to positively. This would explain why the Queen would mysteriously disappear. We later learned this mysterious disappearance had nothing to do with the Queen just leaving, but may be entirely accountable to the authority of Lothric, likely the Twin Princes, locking the Queen away in the Grand Archives, the exact place we can find the Divine Pillar spell, but also a great variety of winged knights said to have worshipped the heretical angels. In this, it's very likely Rosaria was the unnamed Queen of Lothric, but now deemed a heretic, she would have her tongue sliced by what the game tells us to be her firstborn son, suggesting it was under Lorien's orders, something that adds more credence to the idea that the Lothric bureaucracy are accountable to her exile and imprisonment. Now is also a great time to delve into why the angelic message was viewed by Lothric as heretical in the first place. Well, from the detail revealed in the DLC, we learn angels in the game were linked closely with the Hollow Kingdom of Londor and the Sable Church. Many pilgrims ventured to Lothric to die and become angels, no doubt to continue spreading their gospel onto the Queen of Lothric. We know the angels would gain great influence, as even within the walls of the kingdom, the angels control the Dragonslayer armor and other aspects of power from within Lothric. So how did Rosaria escape? Well, this brings us to Rosaria's apostles. We are told by the Divine Pillar's spell that Gertrude, upon receiving her message, would lose both her sight and voice, eerily similar to a being we find right next to Rosaria's cage in the Grand Archives, a man-grub, sightless and voiceless, conveniently located near an open cage, suggesting the man-grubs affiliated with Gertrude freed the Queen, as man-grubs are not seen anywhere else but in Rosaria's bedchamber exclusively. While many may suggest this man-grub was Gertrude herself, there is a far more deep and stronger explanation of who Gertrude is in an upcoming entry, but you'll have to wait for that one. Following her release, we can deduce Rosaria would leave Lothric and find a new home in the Church of the Deep, a place eerily similar to the origins of the Angels, Londor, and the Dark Soul, as the Church of the Deep would become a hotbed for the Abyss and humanity as represented by the dregs of the deep water, something even Pontiff Sullivan would ally with in order to undermine the Age of Fire. When we meet Rosaria, it's clear she has endured great torture with her tongue removed and her body mutated. Her divine heritage has allowed her to become a vessel to be used by her new cohort of champions known as Rosaria's Fingers. Unsurprisingly, they act as red phantoms, not unlike dark wraiths of another humanity-drawn faction from the first game. Leonard even suggests the primary reason to invade in Dark Souls 3 is linked entirely to Rosaria, and it's unsurprising it's a Dark Wraith that drops the Red Eye Orb that allows us to truly fulfill Rosaria's wish for her servants to invade others. The Pale Tongue tells us claiming tongues as trophies was originally the practice of an infamous troop of invaders, who offered them to their speechless goddess, drawing a connection to the Dark Wraiths and her new form in humanity too. We learn the reason she wants this is likely due to lacking her own tongue, as it was forcefully stripped from her. She incentivizes others with finding more tongues by offering her divine powers of rebirth to those who hunt, most likely hoping for a tongue that would fit her own and bring her speech back, a story we'll delve into in more detail for Leonard's entry. Leading to the most important point. It's clear Rosaria, even during her life, was never a great combatant, rather a being of healing, divinely linked to Guinevere, who was too focused entirely on healing as well. Leonard's entry does point to her wielding once the power of the moon, but it's clear in her contemporary form she is entirely defenseless. I place her over others as, much like Ludlith, she is also undying, but unlike Ludlith, the Shrine Handmaiden, or even Emma, her godlike heritage may hold an untold power we are never privy to in the actual gameplay. Beings such as Ludlith or Emma are clearly done with fighting and squirm at the threat of violence, whereas Rosaria, of godly heritage and potentially angelic powers related to Londor, has transcended such a fear, ultimately ranking here on the list. Yorshka is by far the most difficult entry I've ever had to do on any of these lists, as her origins are probably the most contradicted and confusing aspects of the entire lore of Dark Souls. We learn from her dialogue and the descriptions of her items that she is the younger sibling to Gwyndolin, which in itself is an interesting point for two reasons. The first being the sheer scale of power we are working with, as we know Gwyn's children are immensely powerful gods, his firstborn being revered as a god of war, and Gwyndolin the prime authority over the world in Gwyn's absence. However, the second reason this is interesting is because in the first game we learned Gwyndolin was the last born of Gwyn's children, so how is Yorshka affiliated to Gwyndolин's family tree in any way? Well, in truth, it could be a mix of things. The most obvious extension of logic is that Yorshka is not related to Gwyn, but rather the mother of Gwyndolin, an immediate lore brick wall, as the mother of Gwyn's children is not discussed in any capacity within the series. The logic of how Gwyn was given children is associated to comparisons from Zeus and the manner in which he had children, calling back on the stories of Athena being born of Zeus's forehead, requiring no mother at all. So if Yorshka was born of a mystery mother, what can we deduce about this mother from either Gwyndolин's shared heritage to Yorshka and Yorshka herself? The first clue is Yorshka's clear aesthetic similarities to Priscilla. Amongst anything, Yorshka's design is clearly a huge callback to Priscilla, from similar tones to facial features and even a dragon tail to boot. We also learn the area in which she is associated to in Anor Londo is located exactly where the Painted World resided in Dark Souls 1, further drawing parallel to both Priscilla and the Painted World. It's clear she grew up in the Painted World too, as when she references other beings she knows, she refers to either dragons and crows. Of course, dragons tying her to Priscilla's draconic form, but also crows to Velka's influence in the Painted World too. With this being said, does this suggest Gwyndolin's mother may have been Velka? Well, this is unlikely in itself, as Velka's presence in Anor Londo's bureaucracy during Gwyn's reign was clearly well documented, and she is never referred to as being a mother nor a carrier of Gwyn's children. So why does Yorshka refer to Gwyndolin as brother and Gwyn as father? I believe this has far more to do with religious colloquialisms used to refer to subjects of authority within an orthodoxy. We know priests in Christianity are also referred to as father, but also the god of Christianity is referred to in this way too. In reference to Dark Souls 1, we even know Gwyndolin, when inviting us to serve the Blades of the Dark Moon, he asks us if we are willing to swear by the covenant to become a shadow of Father Gwyn and Sister Guinevere, adding further credit to this. I do find the former explanation to be stronger, but this leaves us on the question of strength. Yorshka is clearly related to Priscilla. All context points to her having grown up in the Painted World rather than condemned to it like many others, suggesting while she may not be related to the royal family directly, she may be an offspring of Priscilla. How she ended up in Anor Londo is hard to say, with clever theories around leaving the Painted World or being exiled from the painting and finding a home in Anor Londo under Gwyndolin's authority. We know Priscilla was likely of Seath's experimentation, and thus Gwyndolin in a weird way related to Priscilla, as a portion of Gwyn's soul was indeed present in Seath, and thus Priscilla, Seath's creation, was in a way Gwyn's child, and thus Yorshka of Priscilla's heritage, a grandchild of Seath and Gwyn. Very convoluted, I know, but when are royal families ever not weird? Regarding strength, we know Priscilla was an immensely powerful being, hosting a power even the gods feared in the use of Life Hunt. However, Yorshka does not seem to have access to the use of Life Hunt. In actuality, she seems far more fragile than this altogether, never retaliating and clearly in an area far away from the prying influence of Sullivan while she looked over the Dark Moon Covenant. This may also suggest why Gwyndolin took Yorshka under his wing, as she is a frail being, and Gwyndolin, seeing a familial relation to her, felt it necessary to offer her both sanctuary and protection, as we know she can barely protect herself. Yorshka's chime suggests Gwyndolin knew of Yorshka's great weakness and offered his own chime to her for both protection and to soothe her inevitable loneliness due to the isolation required to keep her safe. When we attack her, she speaks back in disappointment, almost disbelief. We know she doesn't have much in the way of striking back, and the act of self-defense seems entirely alien to her, suggesting she's never had to act in this manner at all. This suggests she took office as the leader of the Dark Moon Covenant, as she may have been the closest confidant and most loyal member of the dwindling power related to Anor Londo during Gwyndolin's authority before Sullivan's usurpation. However, it is incredibly difficult to know if she did have some innate power linked to either Priscilla and Life Hunt, or even potentially the Dark Moon from proximity to Gwyndolin. However, it's more likely Yorshka had neither, and is a clear symbol for royal inbreeding. Her limbs are frail, and her being vastly unnatural to all other beings in the game. I hesitate to put Yorshka too low on this list, as there really is a chance within her is the potential for power related to some of the greatest beings in the entire game. Her access to granting us the same powers Gwyndolin would bestow upon the Dark Moon Blades in Dark Souls 1 reaffirms this, but she clearly represents anything but strength in her contemporary form, and thus ranks far below what a being of royal heritage should. The Locust Preachers appear exclusively in the Ring City DLC in the swampy areas. The race, clearly malformed, may initially seem to be unintelligible fauna related to the murky areas of the game. Of course, from the nature of the deep associated to Irithyll, we learn water holds within it elements of the dark, likely symbolic as to its juxtaposing relationship to fire, and thus the Age of Fire and the source of its power in the First Flame. Our first indication of this is through the story of Pontiff Sullivan, his invocation of the deep and alliance with Aldrich, who is now bloated and consumed by the dark associated with the Church of the Deep, whom were once allied to the Age of Fire to look over the abyss. Within the deep waters are dregs. Dregs are described by the game as hosting a grave likeness to the human form, indicating the properties of the murky water host remnants of the abyss too. This is further reinforced from descriptions related to the Locust Preacher's arm, which colloquially refers to the swamp as the Abyssal Swamp. Abyss, of course, related to humanity and even Manus, a being that once mutated himself and others in a fit of rage and a desperate assertion of their humanity run wild. Naturally, in the Ring City, we learn the area known as the Dreg Heap would become littered with humanoid mutated beings, one of which is the Locust Preacher. The Locust Preacher tells us stories of a variety of other humans from the history of the series, recalling stories from Dark Souls 2 with Ulva, but also a variety of other stories related to an entire assortment of great warriors. He tells us, many of us by the fire forsaken. I speak of thine kind and mine, suggesting the Locust Preachers are not unlike us in the sense we are both beings of the dark and are born from the abyss, hearkening our heritage to the furtive pygmy and the dark soul itself. Interestingly, the Locust Preachers have an incredibly unique drop table, able to give us souls of travellers, nameless soldiers, and even crestfallen knights, suggesting the Locust Preachers are indeed humans from time since gone, re-emerging into the world as their humanity surfaces from the abyss in the murky waters, coming up as dregs and eventually transforming into an assortment of beings such as that of the Locust Preachers. In this, the Locust Preachers may be the humanity associated to some of the greatest warriors in the game, explaining why the Locust Preachers we speak to can give us dialogue around so many historical figures with such great accuracy. However, it's clear in their new forms they are far from the beings they used to be, consumed by an undying appetite not unlike the Abyss, and lost of their humanoid fighting abilities. Locust Preachers rely entirely on their physical attributes, using their arms to swing attacks. Interestingly, their attacks are physical only aesthetically, as they do magic damage, relating them directly to the power associated to what was found by the Church of the Deep. The Preacher's right arm tells us white-faced locust that rose from the abyssal swamp, that happens to perform as a catalyst for sorcery. In the game, their arms are a powerful catalyst, suggesting they host within them the consuming properties of the abyss too, adding context to their power. All in all, while the Locust Preacher is a reflection of ourselves, mirroring the mutated presence of humanity due to Gwyn's original sin, he gives us great insight into humanity as a concept and the solace found by all humans in the abyss. The Locusts are, as their name suggests, pestilent in nature. They are told to be unable to think past their own stomachs and their influence related to the sermons of the dark, something we ourselves are exposed to in the dialogue with the Locust Preacher. They aren't told to be particularly powerful, but their arms are enriched heavily with the power of sorcery. They are agile hunters, but suffer heavily from a clouded judgment resembling that of a hungry animal, and thus they rank here on the list. Greyrat the Thief ends up being the best of humanity. Why this is, we'll have to wait for a certain entry much later down on the list, but what we know of him here is that he is native to Lothric. The most glaring feature of Greyrat, aside from his size, is the hat he adorns. The Thrall hood tells us hood used to cover the head of lesser folk, who were set to work as slaves throughout Lothric, also occasionally used to shame and humiliate criminals. From his dialogue, we know Greyrat is well established in Lothric and may have even grown up here as a street urchin. In this, it's likely Greyrat grew up under the socio-economically oppressed slave class of humans in Lothric. His material conditions would spur him to taking on the art of thievery to get by, something that would eventually lead to his capture and confinement in Lothric Castle, no doubt by the nobility that governed the territory. From a one-dimensional standpoint, it would be easy to assume Greyrat was nothing more than a criminal. Our own hegemonic social apparatuses have us shun criminals regardless of their material upbringing, labelling them as reprehensible to society, so I wouldn't blame you if you felt this way about Greyrat too. However, once we meet Greyrat, we learn between his historic traumas and the walls he has built to confine his own often disregarded emotions lies a man with a will and a moral compass of 1,000 nobles. After thanking us for releasing him, his immediate first request is not related to his own safety, rather it's to ensure one of his friends, Loretta, is given a wellness check and be passed a blue tearstone ring, a ring designed to help those who are mortally wounded. As we go on, we find out why exactly the ring was offered, as Loretta has now since long passed, holding in her clutches a bone, something we can bring back to Greyrat accepting Loretta's death. While initially he seems disappointed rather than emotionally overwhelmed, on our second encounter we can find him curled up, clearly processing the loss of his friend with immense grief, opening up the contextual narrative that Greyrat is a deeply caring figure who carries the weight of his comrades with deep adoration. Extending his gratitude, he offers what he offered to Loretta to us, unequivocal aid to our own journey through Lothric, something he stands true to his own demise. Greyrat's story is filled with parts in which he requires Sigurd's or Patch's aid, and if we don't aid him, he dies and his questline subsequently ends, with his canonical end happening regardless in Lothric Castle. There is very little notation on the strength of Greyrat, but it's clear his ability to navigate and survive the world thus far has been down to one thing: his ability to sneak and get around. This is why he is famously known as the Rat. The weapon he wields is described as a favourite for lowly thieves and bandits, and its description suggests a one-dimensional weapon with little power on its own, but has the capacity to make others bleed, suggesting Greyrat avoided confrontation heavily unless he was granted the upper hand through stealth-based environmental advantages. Greyrat is also clearly quite a frail and small character in the narrative of great characters present in Dark Souls, but clearly still has the capacity to navigate the undead settlement and likely using his stealth and the use of a backstabbing knife to overcome a great upper class population looking to stop him from his thievery. We know other slave-like beings of Greyrat's likeness can be quite formidable, and while he doesn't adorn the complex weaponry of those in the later portions of the game, he does share a lot in common with his peers in the undead settlement, which do rely on backstabbing and stealth to ambush the player. Thus, he ranks here on the list. Henri's story is notably quite tragic. She's never referred to as a great character of power, but she is consistently a victim of a traumatic past. We know from her name that she is from Astora, a region of the world we are first introduced to in Dark Souls 1. We learn Astora modelled itself closely to Anor Londo, specifically the influence left on the world from the ruling gods. In this, much of Astorian society was incredibly close to the prophecies espoused by the Age of Fire. They modelled their knightly tradition off of their Silver Knight tradition initially conceived in Anor Londo, and took on the prophecy of hollowing and linking the First Flame as the ultimate pilgrimage. However, we learn Henri's story would begin in tragedy. Through a series of events, Henri, still a child, would find herself in the Church of the Deep as food for the ever-bloating Aldrich. We learn that Aldrich, particularly the version of him prior to linking the First Flame, was a proper cleric, but with a habit of consuming humans, something that would turn him into an incredibly powerful being and a tool the Age of Fire saw as useful to linking the First Flame. This also helps us understand that the Church of the Deep, while it was still aligned to the Age of Fire, had their power authorized from Anor Londo and the leading bureaucracies within the Age of Fire. It wouldn't be a stretch to assume the geographically close Anor Londo commissioned the Church of the Deep to look over the power of the Deep, potentially even commissioning Aldrich with heading the task. Naturally, as Aldrich was beginning to bloat, they saw a means of undoing Aldrich's gaining influence, but also fulfilling the linking of the First Flame as a sort of two birds and one stone scenario. Aldrich was clearly gaining far too much humanity-orientated power, which inherently threatened the ruling class, so this was a positive on both fronts. However, at the eve of what is likely Henri's execution, she was accompanied by another child named Horace, a boy of potentially Moraine heritage that was not going to let either of them become soul fodder for Aldrich. While Horace's story will be detailed later in the list, we learn Horace murdered the executioner and took his armor while escaping with Henri beside him. We learn Horace and Henri would remain close for the rest of their lives, and Henri even suggests she would wholly rely on Horace to maintain her own safety too. Not much would happen between the events of their escape and their natural death, but we know they would eventually be reborn again as Ashen Ones. Henri, being of Asturian heritage, definitely saw the prophecy of the Ashen Ones linking the First Flame as a worthy pilgrimage, and Horace would naturally follow on too. We learn their first target in consolidating the First Flame was of course the now reborn Aldrich, which may have served too as an opportunity to enact vengeance against a childhood horror that was now back in the material world. However, eventually Henri and Horace would be separated in the catacombs of Carthus, and the following events would paint Henri as not only entirely incapable in maintaining herself towards a journey to Aldrich, but also unable to face the now hollowed Horace, as if we relay his location to Henri, she will attempt to confront him, only to be easily beaten, ending her story. Alternatively, if we don't tell her of Horace's location, she comes to a standstill outside of Sullivan's room, aimless and malleable. If we don't aid her personally, Henri will never attempt to confront Aldrich on her own, and her hopelessness would turn into hollowing. We also know we can take Henri to progress the story regarding the Age of Londor ending, where she is once again forced to enact a grave sacrifice at the behest of something relayed to be much greater than her life. In any case, when Henri's story ends, we learn she holds a straight sword described as the dullest of Astora and potentially tied to some degree of nobility. We know Astora has a ruling structure not unlike Anor Londo, and it's indicated her Astorian heritage has little to do with her power as a knight, rather lineage as a noble, explaining why she is so hopeless when faced against the greater challenges without Horace by her side. Henri's story is tragic. There is no alternative where she isn't stuck with tragedy. Whatever we do, she either goes hollow or becomes sacrificial fodder. Henri, testament to the game, tells us of Dark Souls' most painful rule. Once a path is set out for you, the world will find a way to make it happen. Cuculus is a great quick entry. She is a character we are able to summon as a phantom for the Old Demon King boss battle. Many in the community have come to associate Cuculus to Cornyx, wearing the same armor, but also able to find her body in Cornyx's cage in the Undead Settlement. Her naming convention, but also the spells she casts, also point her place of origins as firmly within the Great Swamp, sharing this with Cornyx too. Her age would suggest that she may have been a student of Cornyx, which is reinforced by Cornyx's history as a tutor. What we do know for certain is that Cuculus carried the Great Swamp's tradition and became a well-renowned pyromancer of the Great Swamp, holding a spotted whip described as common for female pyromancers, but also access to the spell Poison Mist and Flash Sweat. It's likely that she may have been cast out of the Great Swamp due to the Curse of Hollowing, or even as a pilgrimage to follow Cornyx and hone her own pyromancy teachings in the birthplace of the art in Izalith. Cornyx often speaks of Izalith as a mythical place he must visit to gain more knowledge, which adds more credit to this. This is precisely why we can find her within the Smouldering Lake. Unfortunately for Cuculus, Izalith at this point was nearing redundancy, with their great figures on the verge of death and demons in a mostly crippled state, unable to find a home in Izalith. It's likely her mission would have changed from looking to hone her art alongside the great Izalith pyromancers to looking to salvage the remaining text of Izalith to enrich herself, not unlike we do in the game. This is precisely why she will aid us in defeating the Old Demon King. However, it's clear that Cuculus was far out of her depth, as even if she survives the encounter with the Old Demon King, she would eventually succumb to her own ambitions and is left a corpse ready for us to pillage. She never utilizes any chaos spells associated with Izalith, painting the image of a pyromancer who could utilize great pyromancies such as Flash Sweat and Poison Mist, but failing to traverse Izalith and push her knowledge of pyromancy any further than the baseline associated to the Great Swamp. While I won't go too far into the story of Vinheim, as this was more relevant during the first video on the Dark Souls characters, what's important to note here is that Orbeck makes clear the Vinheim Dragon School and the geographical area pertaining to the school have persisted throughout the ages, all the way to the third installment. He even offers dialogue suggesting the school still remembers Big Hat Logan and misses him, affirming again that this is the same school discussed in Dark Souls 1. Interestingly, Orbeck is not the usual cut of Vinheim sorcerers. From Orbeck's ashes, we learn he desperately wanted to join the Vinheim Dragon School, however he lacked the initial talent in sorcery, but by showing a proficiency as an assassin, the Dragon School accepted him into their ranks as a tool for spying and espionage, not unlike the tradition of black sorcerers from Dark Souls 1 and the role that Griggs played. We know the Vinheim Dragon School was so prominent upon their rise to power, the academy itself would govern the geography in which it was situated. Naturally, to exert control from the academy to the wider area, they employed black sorcerers to keep tabs on domestic affairs and, on some occasions, missions to either follow a great sorcerer to document their finds, such as the case for Big Hat Logan and Griggs, or in the case of Orbeck, travel afar and bring home scrolls on ancient and newly developed sorcery. The black sorcery robe tells us, normally a deep blue colour, this black variation is a sign a sorcerer is engaged in surreptitious work. Despite being initially rejected as lacking the innate sorcery required to join the academy, we know even prior to speaking to Orbeck, he had already, all on his own, found success in transferring the knowledge of the Farron sorceries into his own text, as his ashes can grant us access to Farron spells. We likely caught him early in his journey as he tells us to look out for scrolls, something he says he can confidently transfer into practical knowledge. We can take him up on this offer and he can teach us a variety of spells from various scrolls, including but not limited to the golden scrolls of Ulasil, but also Logan scrolls and even the incredibly powerful crystal scrolls. However, it's clear Griggs is a better translator than he is a sorcerer. All descriptors of his character outline him as a researcher rather than someone able to take full advantage of the sorceries he discovers, unlike other vendors who are outright told to be masters of the art, such as Carla or Cornix. Even when we grant him the Farron scroll, he literally says, "Let us ravel this thing so you may put these new sorceries to use," something discreetly different to how Cornix, in reference to new scrolls, tells us it's both of you that may take advantage of the new spells. As what is likely the most clear continuation from the first installment of the game, we have Blacksmith Andre. While we've detailed much of Andre's story in the video on Dark Souls 1, we'll summarise a little about his position there before going into what makes him special in Dark Souls 3. We learn Andre is from the land of Astora, a place we learn is intimately linked to the culture of Anor Londo, and Astora, unlike Thoroland, did not seek to just replicate Anor Londo's theocracy, rather its culture, hierarchy, and even armory too. Astora, and thus Astorian fighters, all adorned knight armour, harkening back the imagery and traditions of the Silver Knights in Anor Londo. Anor Londo's armory was built by the Great Giant Blacksmith, a being that not only armoured the Silver Knights, but also the gods themselves, imbuing their weapons with lightning and other elements. Naturally, Astora, wanting to mirror Anor Londo, also mirrored their smithing traditions, and at the height of this replication was Andre of Astora. Andre was no ordinary imitator either, having worked and befriended the giant smiths of Anor Londo and uniquely understood how they utilise various unique materials and embers. We get this context as once we gift him the giant's coal, he can not only teach us the techniques once used by the giant blacksmiths, but also speaks openly about the giant blacksmith in a familiar and jovial tone, outright telling us he misses the giant blacksmith's company. In the third installment, Andre has risen far beyond his contemporaries and can utilise all embers, even those of dark and sorcery, suggesting his long tenure has made him a true master of his craft, one that has the capacity to do what the giant blacksmith can, but also the Vinheim smiths and even Vamos. Andre, having lived through the ages, can even recount the ancient history of the world, giving us insight into the Abyss, Izalith, the giants, and even the gods of Anor Londo. However, much like the first game, it's clear clear Andre was never outwardly that distinct of a combatant. His preservation in the world is more than likely attributable to the kinship he would build with various champions who offered their protection to him because of his consistently selfless attitude to aiding those seeking to link the first flame. However, much like the first game, the clues from his hammer do suggest Andre was proficient in self-defense too. We know in the first game he distinctly fights in an almost superhuman manner with just his bare hands, laying the groundwork to suggest he may have possessed superhuman strength too, adding further credit to how he was able to rise to the rank of even the great giant blacksmith that once armored Gwyn himself. His hammer tells us while it's a great tool for blacksmithing, in the hands of Andre it has a secret potential of being able to serve as a striking weapon that can break down a variety of heavy armory, with the caveat that he has survived through more ages than anyone else in the game, and his clear tenured experience through a great majority of the world in his expedition to learn of various artifacts. It's no doubt Andre hides a great strength relative to the other vendors in the game, but the mystery around his true potential keeps his position quite speculative, and thus he ranks here on the list. Albert brings back the old traditions of Ferosa discussed in the Dark Souls 2 video. Standing guard of the Twin Princes, he is one of the three beings dutied to protect royalty against intruders. While his naming convention and his armory may point towards Albert being a true-to-form Ferosan knight from the second installment of the game, his armor's description points the story in a different direction. It tells us this set is named after a god of war. The armor of the Ferosa Lion Knights was preserved even after the destruction of their homeland. This indicates it wasn't the Knights of Ferosa that preserved, rather it was their armory that would. Albert does not hold typical Ferosan weaponry, nor from Eleum Lois under the Burnt Ivory King's authority, suggesting Albert may have been an ordinary knight in Lothric that rose the ranks of the civilization and demonstrated enough strength that he would adorn the Lion Knight armor as an indication of his ferocity. Why the Kingdom of Lothric had preserved the armory is hard to say, but it's likely related to the god of war associated with Ferosa. We knew this god of war only as Faram in the previous installment, but context always pointed towards Faram being related to Gwyn's firstborn son, the Nameless King, and a god of war in his own right too. Naturally, Lothric's bureaucracy may have honoured the armory as a continuation of Gwyn's legacy and held the set awaiting a warrior that in turn honoured the Nameless King too. Another great indication of Albert stepping up to Ferosa's legacy is the summon sign associating him to Bort of the Boreal Valley. Of course, the Boreal Valley itself shares striking motifs with Eleum Lois, and naturally Albert stepping up to contest Vort draws this parallel much closer. Much like other beings linked to the protection of the Twin Princes, we know Albert had an affinity to Emma, something evidenced as he leaves our world as a phantom if Emma is killed, drawing again the unique position he held in Lothric's bureaucracy and the strength likely required to gain this rank. As the only character to maintain Ferosa's legacy and honoured as a Lion Knight, Albert stands tall as a greater defender of the Kingdom of Lothric and therefore ranks here on the list. Yellowfinger Hazel brings to life the legend of Ulasil into the final installment of the series. While true Ulasil in many ways exists in a host of things due to Manus' legacy, Ulasil as a historical cultural region is often overshadowed by the events of the Abyss. Hazel's pick gives us a crucial bit of insight as to who Hazel is. We learn from its description that Hazel is referred to as a Xanthus scholar. While this may suggest a direct lineage to Ulasil, we know Ulasil scholars took on the naming convention as mystics, not scholars, suggesting Hazel may be more of a researcher related to the lost civilization. We get more detail on Hazel from the description of the Great Farron Dart, telling us directly she lineated from the faction associated to the Legion in Farron. We are told Hazel was the daughter of the leader of the Legion, tying her closer to the region we know as Farron rather than Ulasil. And while it may stand geographically in the area associated to the Darkroot Gardens and thus Ulasil, it's clear the reigning authority of this region is related to the legacy of Artorias rather than Ulasil itself. We know Artorias was not a Ulasil resident, nor associated to the Mystics. He was a member of Gwyn's Round Table of Knights, tasked with dispelling the elements of the dark, only to find a brutal end in Ulasil's township at the hands of Manus, the Father of the Abyss. The Legion of Farron, or more so the Abyss Watchers, would be inspired by Artorias' actions and develop the Legion as a bastion against the Abyss, much like Artorias was. We are told by the Exile Mask that Farron's keep quickly became consumed by the woods, until eventually a wolf reinvigorated the Abyss Watchers' legacy in the new Legion of Farron, one that had its own bureaucracy, and likely within them a leader emerged. While we don't know for sure the identity of the leader, we learn he would become prominent enough the Legion of Farron would gain great recognition, eventually sparking the interest of a certain Preacher Twins and later Crystal Sages, who brought with them great knowledge of Logan's old work and helped the Legion devise new spells to keep the Legion alive in the absence of the Abyss Watchers. However, we do know there was a tradition of spellcasting that predated the Crystal Sage's influence, as Hazel, daughter of the leader, would quickly rise and take residence in Farron's Keep. She would devise a spell known as the Farron's Dart. This stood as a baseline from which the Crystal Sages would refine into the Legion's sorcery arsenal. Descriptions related to the scroll that grants us Farron's spells even suggest the Great Crystal Sages saw a very special talent in Hazel and were inspired to refine and nurture it alongside her. More context is given as the Great Farron Dart tells us sorcery which improves upon the Farron Dart, entrusted to the leaders of the Legion's acolytes, and apparently a sorcery of his daughter Hazel that was refined by a Crystal Sage. However, during this period, it appears Hazel was beginning to find herself fascinated to a very different mission than the one associated with her father, as within Farron's Keep she likely found evidence of a civilization from long ago, stumbling upon scripture related to the old Ulasil mystics. This would take her on a new journey, dedicating herself to uncovering the mysteries and power of this civilization. Evidence of Hazel's success in uncovering the mysteries of Ulasil can be found in Farron through the Golden Scroll, a scroll likely written by Hazel as a formalization of her research, as the item sprite is clearly not an old scroll from Ulasil, and its description even indicates it's related to the research of Xanthus scholars rather than the true Ulasil mystics. This also suggests Hazel would gain a few followers during her tenure as a self-renowned Xanthus scholar, evidenced by the pluralization of the description. After learning a majority of Ulasil's old spells such as that of Cast Light, Repair and Hidden Body, all spells that are purely utility focused rather than of power, she would go further and learn of Jeremiah's story, a man who once resided as a monarch in Ulasil. Of course, we know from the first installment that Xanthus King Jeremiah's story goes far beyond just his time in Ulasil, as he would gather great power from Izalith and even the Painted World in his own search for power. Naturally, as Hazel followed the thread, she would eventually too follow Jeremiah's story, and while we don't know how far she went, we do know she would learn of his curious and distinct hat and create replicas for herself and other researchers, formally referring to themselves as Xanthus scholars rather than Ulasil mystics based on this. Nevertheless, we learn Jeremiah's story culminated finally in the Painted World of Ariamis, taking residence in Velka's territory, one that took pity on the oppressed and forgotten beings of the world, including Hollows. In a similar sense, we learn Hazel would eventually follow a similar route, renouncing the Legion of Farron and allying herself with Rosaria's Fingers. We know Jeremiah's great strength would be formalized in pyromancy and direct associations to his travels in Izalith, something detailed in his own entry in the Dark Souls 1 video. Nevertheless, it's clear Hazel was a great researcher and a great sorcerer, not a pyromancer, and thus she never truly formalized Jeremiah's strength. This of course is all evidenced in our own encounter with her, where she is able to use Great Farron Dart, clearly taking on the influence of the Crystal Sages during her time as a legionary in Farron. We aren't ever told she was an immense fighting force, and the greatest commendation of her power is related to the Great Farron Dart and the compliments from the immensely powerful and Logan-inspired Crystal Sages. Unfortunately, it's clear her obsession with bringing to life Ulasil, and specifically the legacy of Jeremiah, steered her away from further developing herself as a mentee to the Crystal Sages, ultimately standing as one of the greater Farron sorcerers and an even greater researcher, placing her here on the list. While unnamed and seemingly related only to the mindless non-character mobs in the game, the Giant of the Undead Settlement actually holds within themselves a character with allegiances and alliances. Our first introduction to the Giant of the Undead Settlement is through a brutal exchange of heavy spears seemingly dropped from the heavens itself. The curious may have taken their time to look above to see the direction of fire is actually coming from a conveniently located giant, reminiscent of Sen's fortress. However, Sen's fortress had very bulky and brutish giants, ones that relied on hurling large objects. This giant is much more refined in the use of a modern tool, the great bow, and thus we can make a closer comparison between this giant to Hawkeye Goth, and much like Hawkeye Goth, we can befriend him and even share some dialogue too. Naturally, many players initially assume this may actually be Goth himself, who was a bit more rugged through the ages since the first game. However, the hallmarks of Goth aren't present here, such as his unique armor or even his unique bow. In Goth's entry, however, we learned the bowman class of giants were entirely related to the tradition of dragon slayers from the first game. We learned Goth assumed the role of a general amongst this rank of Gwyn's army, of course leaving room for lesser bowmen. In this, it would not be a stretch to assume the undead settlement giant and their likeness to Goth may be related to the tradition of giant archers first initiated by Goth, and thus the giant in question a descendant of the giants linked to this tradition. This is precisely why the giant archer drops the hawk ring first attributed to Goth. The ring tells us this ring is associated with Hawkeye Goth, suggesting this isn't Goth's ring, but rather the ring that symbolizes being of Goth's cohort of archers. We learn Goth, one of the 4 great knights of Gwyn, would leave Anor Londo to aid in Ulasil against the rising threat of the Abyss, and when we speak to Goth he talks fondly of the giant blacksmith, suggesting they were old friends. In Dark Souls 3, we can find the giant blacksmith amongst other giants in and around Anor Londo and Irithyll, suggesting the giants still enjoyed the protection of Anor Londo under Gwyndolin's authority, and only once Sullivan conquered the land and declared himself its ruler did the giants fall into subjugation, many even killed, including the giant blacksmith himself. It wouldn't be too far a stretch to assume the giant archer also came from Anor Londo and may have even fled the city after Sullivan's coup. We know in Dark Souls 1 the Hawk Ring is in the possession of the giant blacksmith. This may suggest the giant blacksmith aided the giant archer in his escape of Anor Londo, bestowing a great bow and the Hawk Ring, as he may have seen within this giant a glimmer of his old friend Goth, and thus to preserve the giants sent him away, which also gives us insight as to why the giant blacksmith is found freshly deceased in Anor Londo during Dark Souls 3. The commendation from the giant blacksmith and the great armourer of the gods themselves does assume he saw within the giant archer a power adjacent to Goth, or at least reminiscent, and thus in goodwill sought to it that he survived, adding great strength to the power we can assume for the giant archer. We know after his escape from Anor Londo, the giant archer eventually would find himself near what remained of Ulasil, near the Farron Swamp. The reason for this is probably linked closely to Goth too, as it was Goth who once stood at a watchtower looking over Ulasil. In a similar sense, the giant archer looks over the primary remnants of Ulasil known as the White Birch Trees, these linked intimately to the dusk of Ulasil herself. There really isn't much else to the giant archer's story. He stands as a spiritual successor to Goth, not in strength but in character. However, the giant blacksmith would have had many giants to choose from to let go of and fulfill Goth's old role, and it's not surprising we don't really see giant archers elsewhere in the game, suggesting the giant archer was historically related to Goth's incredibly powerful dragon slayer tradition, and thus the blacksmith knew the only giant strong enough to conduct themselves in Goth's absence was going to be the one we meet in the undead settlement. Giant archers were integral to bringing down the everlasting dragons. Goth's story is one filled with power so great he stood adjacent to Artorias, Havel and Ornstein. The giant blacksmith, having lived long enough to witness all these great warriors in action, suggests the giant archer was far beyond the pale for ordinary giants. However, it's clear he relied on some degree of conspiracy to leave Anor Londo and the clutches of Sullivan, avoiding the fate a majority of other giants endured. He doesn't adorn any dragon iconography indicative of having been present during the War of Ancients, and he most likely looks over the white birch tree at a distance for his own safety. In this, while a great throwback to Goth, he ultimately ranks here on the list. Sigurd is a joyous return to one of the most beloved nations in the game, that being the land of Katarina. We've spoken about the shifting political structures of various regions in the game, from New Londo spiritually succeeded by Londor, Karim and Thorolund's fusion, and even the changing bureaucracy of Anor Londo under Sullivan and Irithyll. Interestingly, however, Katarina, a place known for a good drink but also fight-hardened warriors bound by duty alone, has remained the same through the ages of the game. While we initially met two separate Katarinians in Dark Souls 1, with Sigmaya being an aloof warrior constantly requiring our aid to overcome challenges, but also Sieglind, his daughter, whom was incredibly intelligent and expertly skilled in fighting, Sigurd is, in a sense, a spiritual continuation of both, a synthesis of both characters, for better and for worse. With this being said, our first encounter with Sigurd is representative of aloofness, unable to wrap his head around a simple elevator. He lets us know of his origins in Katarina, but also his tendency towards empathy rather than outright violence, choosing diplomacy and conversation to navigate his way through his own journey. He tells us of wanting to speak to the giant of the undead settlement to get him to stop throwing arrows, something he briskly forgets about once he falls off the elevator onto the platform leading to the fire demon. Our second encounter echoing the first, asking us to choose from confronting the demon and the potential that he could cool the demon down through diplomatic means. Eventually, after a bout of our own impatience, he aids us in killing the demon, something we, much like with Sigmaya in Dark Souls 1, need to aid him in, as he basically dies 100% of the time if unaided, and if he dies, the story ends right here. This theme of rescuing and aiding Sigurd follows us through the entire game, having to aid him after he was taken advantage of by Patches, to freeing him after being locked in a cell. Up to this point, it's clear Sigurd seems just as incapable as Sigmaya. So where does the aspect of Sieglind play into his story? Well, the first indication of this is a sly detail that Sigurd can potentially save Greyrat in Irithyll from an ambush by the sewer centipedes, which is deeply overshadowed by his true act of selflessness, aiding us killing the Lord of Cinder, known as Yorm. The Storm Ruler tells us great sword with a broken blade, also known as the Giant Slayer for the residual strength of the storm that brings giants to their knees. Yorm the giant once held two of these, but gave one away to the humans that doubted him and left the other to a dear friend before facing his fate as a Lord of Cinder. Of course, we can find the first Storm Ruler beside Yorm's feet, but the other is in the possession of none other than Sigurd himself, suggesting this dear friend was clearly Sigurd, something reinforced by Sigurd's dialogue in Yorm's boss battle. Sigurd thus far has shown the value of his character had mostly to do with his righteousness and principled stance of duty and doing the right thing, especially for those in need. And it may be most likely that Yorm granted Sigurd his bane not because Sigurd was the most capable, rather he was the most duty-bound and pure of heart, knowing much like Sieglind would do for her own father, Sigmaya would do for him, slay him in exceptional circumstances, most likely as a check and balance against Yorm's rule over the people of the profaned capital. We know even after aiding us with Yorm, Sigurd dies of the mortal wounds caused by Yorm, regardless of our actions, and while he's not as incompetent as Sigmaya, relying less on our intervention and actually traversing some seriously treacherous territory all on his own, he does require our intervention numerous times to give him a push to his final mission, and ultimately only confronts Yorm with us by his side, painting the picture of a being between the strength of both Sieglind and Sigmaya, and assurance to us that Katarina is some of the best the world had to offer, ultimately placing him here on the list. Introduced to us as a man of few words and a companion to the more extroverted Henri of Astora, Horace the Hushed is a character with ties to the mass imprisonment of humans at the behest of Aldrich's ever-consuming bloat. We learn from Henri's entry that Aldrich, particularly the version of him prior to linking the First Flame, was a proper cleric, but with a habit of consuming humans, something that would turn him into an incredibly powerful being, and a tool the Age of Fire saw as useful to linking the First Flame. This also helps us understand the Church of the Deep, especially while it was still aligned to the Age of Fire, had their power authorized from Anor Londo and the leading bureaucracies within the Age of Fire. It wouldn't be a stretch to assume the geographically close Anor Londo commissioned the Church of the Deep to look over the power of the Deep, potentially even commissioning Aldrich with heading this task. Naturally, as Aldrich was beginning to bloat, they saw a means of undoing Aldrich's gaining influence and also fulfilling the linking of the First Flame from a being that had notoriously gained a great and powerful soul. During this period, we learn Horace and Henri, both children at this point, were also imprisoned in the Church of the Deep to further build Aldrich's power. However, one day it would be Horace and Henri that would escape the clutches of Aldrich's Road of Sacrifice. We learn from the executioner set that they may have left their prison on the eve of their execution, and it was likely Horace, even as a child, who would kill the executioner, don his armour and route an escape for both him and Henri. We aren't told how powerful the executioner was at this point, but it's assumed from the description of the executioner's armour that he was notoriously powerful as a killer. He was so prolific in executions, we are told it would eventually even corrupt him, suggesting Horace, even as a child, was incredibly formidable. We aren't told exactly why Horace was so powerful, but his Llewellyn shield does indicate a heritage in Mirror, a place known for developing great warriors from a very young age. We aren't told where both Henri's and Horace's story would go next, but we know they would eventually reach the end of their lives, only to be brought back to life as Ashen Ones charged with linking the First Flame, likely indicating before they died they attempted this too. Naturally, the First Flame was never going to be their main task, as on the eve of their rebirth, both Henri and Horace had only one goal: to confront their childhood horror and defeat the now reborn Aldrich. We know from Henri's story that tragically both of their journeys would come to an end due to an untimely separation, adding further context to why Horace, at the final moments of his life, having lost Henri, was left dutiless and ripe to becoming hollow. It's indicated that Horace was not necessarily beaten, but rather an environmental trap would separate both beings. We know the successes related to Henri getting as far as she did was wholly dependent on Horace. She even refers to him in various scenarios as her only means of traversing the land. There isn't a lot of other details given here, but we know Horace, likely after being reborn, would take on the mantle of a Blue Sentinel, a Covenant allied to the power that once propped Gwendolyn, with the context that he aided Henri through various treacherous portions of the game, but notably the context that he, even as a child, undermined a great power in the Church of the Deep, that being the Executioner, suggests Horace was far from a weak character, and despite a traumatic past, remains a bulwark that pushes Henri's story to its eventual tragic end, placing Horace here on the list. It's no coincidence Cornyx and Laurentius from Dark Souls 1 share the same title. Both represent the story of pyromancy in the ordinary realm of humans, away from the primordial power at the heart of Izalith. We learn from Dark Souls 1 that the Great Swamp became one of the first proper homes for pyromancy outside of the influence of Izalith. Originally, they became a larger insular community due to the antagonisms associated with the Chaos Flame at the heart of their power. Of the first human pyromancers was a man named Salamon, a great student of Quelana. We know from the first video on this topic that Quelana is directly associated to the art of pyromancy itself. Under Quelana's direct mentorship, Salamon would obtain mastery over pyromancy and eventually leave his position as an apprentice to Quelana and eventually find residence in the Great Swamp. We know this as Salamon's dispersal of Quelana's pyromancy would reach an individual named Carmina, another great pyromancer associated with the Great Swamp, and eventually she would pass this down to many others, such as her student Laurentius. In this, the Great Swamp would have its foundations firmly in the history of Salamon's teachings, and by extension, the teachings of Quelana, suggesting the Great Swamp would have deep in its roots the fundamental value of learning. It's therefore no surprise that Cornyx is best represented as both a teacher but also a student. Earlier we spoke about Cuculus's ties to Cornyx as a potential teacher, sharing his crow-like aesthetic uniquely attributed to him with ties to the origins of his name too. We also know Cornyx is very open to us about his ability to teach. When speaking to him, he tells us, "To learn pyromancies you must vow to become my pupil. I know, but such is the way of the world. Respect your elders," and so on. Clearly giving us further insight into the culture of the Great Swamp as one of teachers and one of the taught, a sort of passing of the torch integral to the preservation of their society. Within Cornyx's ashes, the description tells us Cornyx was tired and defeated until he discovered one final pupil, like so many pyromancers before him, further supporting the nature of both Cornyx and those of the Great Swamp. It's clear Cornyx didn't just become a great teacher with many apprentices of his own, but also became renowned for being something of a great historian and researcher too. The description of the spell Fire Surge tells us, Cornyx is a venerable pyromancer of an older mould, said to have restored a number of spells lost to the past, amongst which this is the most well known. Fire Surge is an interesting spell, as in Dark Souls 1 its description tells us pyromancy foreign to the Great Swamp. Not all pyromancy originates in the Great Swamp. One hears rumours of unknown pyromancers inhabiting various lands, and this spell is the work of one such outlander. From the nature of where we find this spell, we learn it's keenly related to the painted world of Ariamis, suggesting the pyromancer to devise this spell resided within the painting, potentially pointing to the great Xanthus King Jeremiah himself. We aren't given many clues as to how exactly Cornyx rediscovered various lost pyromancies and specifically the spell Fire Surge, but we do know he has a very keen eye in translating the texts of greater tomes into practical lessons to teach us. We can grant him the Karthus Pyromancy Tome and even the Great Swamp Pyromancy Tome, but the most important being the Izalith Tome, something related to the literal lessons given to Salamon by Quelana herself, as per its own description. On the other hand, it's clear Cornyx himself is far from an outstanding pyromancer to rival giants such as Salamon, as his standard repertoire of spells has him make use of mostly ordinary spells of the Great Swamp, with a slight detail that he may also have a varying degree of lost ancient pyromancies in his arsenal too, with Fire Surge being the only one outlined in the gameplay. However, unlike Orbeck, we learn Cornyx is not only able to translate tomes to us to enrich our understanding of spellcasting, instead he's able to utilise his existing talents in discovery and pyromancy to learn beside us. Once we hand him the Izalith tome, he tells us, now, show it here quickly, let us channel them together, the primal pyromancies known only to old Master Salamon. Suggesting these tomes are specifically also enriching his own knowledge of pyromancy, and with the evidence that he is both a great renowned pyromancer from the Great Swamp, whom once had many pupils of his own, but also the knowledge that he represented best the Great Swamp's tradition of lifelong learning and practice, we have to assume he is beside us, being enriched heavily with the tomes as well. Because of this, I will be ranking Cornyx on the condition that we have given him all of the above tomes. In this, we learn within the tomes he can decipher for us and learn beside us are spells such as Chaos Storm and Great Chaos Fire Orb, both spells that take directly from the power of Izalith herself. From Dark Souls 1, the Great Chaos Fireball tells us Art of the Flame of Chaos, which engulfed the Witch of Izalith and her daughters, while the description of Chaos Storm from Dark Souls 1 adds the context that all pyromancies of the Chaos prefix draw directly from the mutating fire of Izalith during the very moments she sought to copy the first flame. Through this, we learn Cornyx, despite his humble dialogue, holds the power to channel the chaos, something only very few pyromancers have thus been able to command. We also know a pyromancer's flame is just as important to channeling great pyromancies, and the stronger bond one has with their flame, the greater power they can conjure from it, suggesting despite a regular initial repertoire of spells, Cornyx had a deep enough affinity to pyromancy to conjure the powers of Izalith herself. While this may put him closer to the Great Salamon, we are told by Cornyx himself he doesn't quite stand beside him in power. On top of this, we learn Izalith itself, especially in the third game, has had its flame dulled immensely since the great emergence of Izalith in the first game. And as we know, pyromancy requires channeling the existing power of Izalith for strength. This suggests being a pyromancer has lost its strength between the ages, especially one that relies heavily on the Chaos Flame, such as Cornyx at the height of his questline. We learn as the list goes on that distinctly powerful pyromancers in the age since the Chaos Flame has subsided have taken to utilizing the power of dark to enrich the flames with a deeper power. We know humanity is an immense source of power for flames that are due to die, which is why Gwyn sought humans to relink the flame in a cyclical manner. In a similar sense, the power of pyromancy in its fading form requires humanity, aka the Dark Soul, to bring back its historical relevance. This, of course, is something we'll discuss further in Carla's entry, but on the topic of Carla's relevance to Cornyx, we learn Cornyx is entirely unable to teach the knowledge related to Quelana's tome or even tomes of pyromancy, since enriched with the power of humanity and the dark, suggesting Cornyx's knowledge had its limits, especially around the utilization of darkness with his pyromancy to bring it to the level of beings such as Carla and the once great Wolnir. Ultimately placing Cornyx here on the list, a great image of Salamon and the Great Swamp's most rigid traditions, but ultimately far too late in the timeline to truly project the influence of Izalith. Cirrus of the Sunless Realm, as her title suggests, hails from a region of the game associated to a place that is without any sun. Naturally, at its face, we would assume this is related to a land linked to the Dark Soul, as the sun symbolizes the Age of Fire. However, if we cast our mind back to the first game, we find the Sunless Realm may actually refer to a place much more holy in origin. One of the greatest secrets in the first game are those associated to the nature of Anor Londo. We learn Guinevere and the symbol of the kingdom in the age since Gwyn's abandonment was nothing but an illusion, coming to realise it was actually Gwyndolin who was its true authority. Gwyndolin casting an illusion of the sun over Anor Londo to preserve the cultural hegemony of the Age of Fire in a time the Age of Fire was facing its material contradictions with the fading of the first flame. In this, we learn Anor Londo was truly sunless, dark, tempered, and under the authority of a god that didn't hold fire as their source of power, rather it was the dim light of the moon. We learn Gwyndolin's monopoly of power over Anor Londo and Lordran in general was through the secret police force known as the Dark Moon Covenant, a tradition maintained even during the final installment under the authority of Company Captain Yorshka. In the third installment, those who are of the Sunless Realm are described by the Sunless Set as knights who serve the Nameless Moon, and perhaps it's for this reason the attire cast a feminine silhouette, pointing towards Gwyndolin's feminine presenting appearance despite being assigned male at birth. In the game, Cirrus utilizes a talisman known as the Sunless Talisman. Its description tells us that it is often given to knights of the Sunless Realm who serve the Nameless Moon. If we once again cast our mind back to Dark Souls 1, it's clear if the Sunless Realm is Anor Londo, the Nameless Moon would point directly towards the authority of Anor Londo during this period. This, of course, was Gwyndolin. We're told Gwyndolin remained nameless, and this may be the case as we know Gwyndolin was incredibly secretive of his identity and rule over Anor Londo. As we learn, behind his strength was a power that would resemble the power of the moon and sorcery, aspects that weren't directly representative of Gwyn's Age of Fire, rather the power of soul manipulation, something with a publicly tarnished reputation due to Seath's maddened state. As Cirrus is outright referred to us as a Knight of the Sunless Realm and associated with the Nameless Moon, we can deduce she is a standing member of the Dark Moon Covenant, a covenant that acted as Gwendolyn's monopoly of power over Anor Londo and the surrounding lands, often in secrecy. We know Anor Londo in the current era has been usurped by Pontiff Sullivan, but despite this claim over the territory, the Covenant remains intact due to Yorshka presiding over the Covenant in Gwendolyn's absence. We learn out of all of the other standing members of the Dark Moon Covenant, it's Cirrus that has either been tasked by Yorshka or on her own volition that has chosen to challenge the Pontiff's authority, likely to retrieve Anor Londo from the Pontiff for the Dark Moon Covenant. Her questline progresses based on actions relating to undermining Sullivan's authority, from defeating the Sullivan Beast to defeating the Deacons of the Deep too. Naturally, this also put her into adversity with the Covenant associated to Rosaria's fingers. We learn Rosaria, after the revelations of Londor's angels, would align herself with the Dark and thus found safety within the area associated to the Church of the Deep, under the supervision of an archdeacon associated to both the Church and Pontiff Sullivan, this of course being Kilm. Cirrus even abandons her own questline with us if we associate ourselves with Rosaria's Covenant, making the adversity much more clear. However, the most clear example of this is when Creighton the Wanderer, now aligned to Rosaria's fingers, is assigned directly to assassinate Cirrus in her own world, something we have to aid her in to progress her questline, indicating Creighton alone was great enough to take on Cirrus. We'll come back to Creighton in his own entry to go into this further, but this outright lets us know that Creighton was greater than Cirrus. However, aiding Cirrus in this fashion doesn't end here. As we learn, she has another great mission up her sleeve relating both to her Covenant's duties, but also a personal gesture that she seeks to enact before her own story comes to an end. That is, of course, dispatching her granddad, Hodrick. Hodrick, as we learn, was a member of the Moundmaker Covenant, a covenant seemingly built and maintained by Hodrick to, as the vertebrae item description states, unshackle humans from the influence of gods. We learn from the sunset armor worn by Hodrick, he too, not unlike his daughter Cirrus, was a part of the Dark Moon Covenant and loyal to Anor Londo's bureaucracy. However, he would, as many Hollows do, become skeptical on the nature of the Age of Fire's authority and come to the conclusion that the gods did not love humans. Humans were just a means of projecting their influence. Leaving his old life behind, he would embark on a campaign of murdering humans likely adjacent to the Age of Fire and tearing from them their vertebrae, said to connect them to the gods, a true act of anti-theism that would characterize Hodrick's post-Dark Moon state of mind. Naturally, Cirrus being fervently a Dark Moon Blade, but also the granddaughter of this notorious blasphemer, saw to it that her final act was to lay her father to rest and relieve him of his perceived madness. However, much like Creighton, this is a battle that requires our intervention, proving her grandfather's strength as greater. Regarding her strength, we learn she is one of a few characters that can cast the Dark Moon Blade, a spell that requires reaching the upper ranks of the Dark Moon Covenant, assuring us that Cirrus, despite the Dark Moon's waning influence, still stands tall as one of their most prominent members. While the Dark Moon Blades are a speck of what they used to be, they remain a prominent force against other factions such as Rosaria's Fingers, and a force that can guide us all the way to the Twin Princes too. We also know Cirrus lineates from a line of great Dark Moon warriors. Considering how powerful we know the Dark Moons were and how rigorous their recruitment process is in the first game, it's likely her lineage meant she was trained from an early age to stand as a strong and independent representation of the Dark Moon Covenant and the power of her ancestors. This context does paint Cirrus to be a powerful force, one that is representative wholly of the Dark Moon Covenant. However, we know the Dark Moon Covenant is not the great police force it used to be, and thus her place and power derived from the Covenant less significant due to this waning influence, ultimately placing Cirrus here on the list. Following directly from the story of Irina, Egon yet again describes the synthesis between Kareem and Thorolund, its dialectical relationship through history, and its new material reality as a modern iteration of both. I encourage you all to go back to Irina's entry if you missed that, as it's naturally important to Egon's story too. As we learned from Irina's entry, the paladin tradition once erected by Thorolund and the great story of a legendary chosen undead known as Leroy would build a warrior cleric class of humans. Men of all ages would be taught as both clerics, but also proficient with weaponry such as morning stars. Their duties lay in the protection of high priests and royalty and maintaining the monopoly of power ever so important to Lloyd retaining control despite Gwyn's self-imposed exile at the throne of the First Flame. We're told during this integration of both societies, a great warrior known as Morn would rise up as a perfection of both cultures. Morn was liberal in his espousement of divinity as he accepted a deity known as Caither, a being with questionable links to the orthodox theocratic structure associated with the First Flame, but nonetheless worthy of divinity and warmth, as under the now reformed Kareem, all were worthy of divine forgiveness. As we spoke of during Irina's entry, no other holy women of Kareem's nation were more prominent than the saints. We learn Irina was one of such a saint that sought the ultimate sacrifice of her own flawed humanity through the ritual of becoming a firekeeper. With such great ambition and being a saint of Kareem, naturally her journey was to be followed and kept straight by only the most renowned paladin of Kareem, someone who represented the legendary paladin Morn. This premise brought back the great stories of Caither and Morn, and Egon was going to see it through that he came back with Irina as a firekeeper and him as a great paladin who saw this through. The Morn set tells us Kareem knights dedicate an entire career to attending a single maiden, just as Morn once served one goddess alone. And we learn from Morn's great hammer that it was only ever granted to the most powerful paladins of the greatest unwavering faith. While Egon is not Morn, it is important to assess any Kareem knight based on their proximity to Morn, and thus knowing how powerful Morn is, but also how close Egon was to Morn in strength, is our key to ranking him on the list. While we aren't given a great deal of information on Morn, we do know the nation of Kareem was filled to the brim with great warriors, beings such as the great Oswald, Lautrec, and even magnificent Chester. We learn Morn more than anyone else would find a way to unify both the scattered religious worshippers of Kareem, but also absorb Thorolund into one unified kingdom, as he is consistently referred to by item descriptions as being most accountable to its contemporary form. In Dark Souls, great unifiers are often synonymous with great warriors, as we learn the landscape of the game seldom takes well to change, and violence is often the only vehicle for change. Vendrick required the power of lords themselves, and Pontiff Sullivan required a multifaceted usurpation to gain control over Irithyll and Anor Londo, unified under the Deep's influence. In a similar sense, Kareem, a place plagued with various deities, worshippers, and inter-regional antagonisms, may have required a similar feat. This is why Morn is juxtaposingly referred to as a great holy and forgiving figure who cared deeply for a deity of tears, but also a man with a twisted rage. We also know between the great members of Morn's paladins, only a few would be decorated with the Great Hammer, as the hammer itself is said to have channeled the power once associated to Morn. It's described to be enchanted by a ward of Kareem Temple, but also imbued with the twisted rage of Apostle Morn. We also learn that Egon's background also hosts a story of strength at a personal level. His moaning shield tells us a deformed great shield given to Egon of Kareem upon being conferred knighthood. The giant woman's face that protects Egon is that of his sister, some years his senior. This tells us Egon may have come from a line of nobility from the Temple of Kareem. We are told the shield itself is blessed by his sister, inferring the shield itself is not just memorabilia. As we learn, his sister's icon grants him protection with a special ability confirming its divinity. Of course, suggesting his sister held a high place at the Temple of Kareem, and an aspect of her, be it her soul or a blessing of her memory, enchants Egon. This may also explain why Kareem felt confident Egon could follow a saint on her mission in becoming a firekeeper, as Egon not only represented a power of the top of Kareem's paladin class, but also the power of its divinity with his sister. It's for this precise reason Egon represents the best of Kareem. While he's not Morn himself, nor is he Leroy, he represents best the power they held since their passing, ultimately ranking here on the list. Alva is first introduced to us in Dark Souls 2. However, we only ever learn of Alva's existence through the description of his set. It tells us Alva crossed many a land in search for a cure for Saint Soretta's sickness, but failed and relinquished his knighthood. We aren't ever told of the nature of who Saint Soretta was, but we do know the term saint is often only reserved for great clerics related to the Age of Fire's theocratic structure. A great example of this is, of course, Saint Aldrich. While Aldrich would diverge from the Age of Fire after being resurrected, we learn his sainthood was assumed prior to this, while he stood close to the Age of Fire and even linked the First Flame. In this, it may assume Alva had come from a land beholden to the Age of Fire's theology. Naturally, this could point to a variety of different places, but we know his story is best spoken of during Dark Souls 2, and thus it could relate to Volgan, a country under the supervision of a theocratic authority. However, this is also put into question as we learn the weapon of choice associated to Alva was actually the Murakumo. In Dark Souls 3, the Murakumo tells us the curved greatsword of Alva, Seeker of the Spurn, specially forged in an eastern land. Of course, the association to the Murakumo being wielded by Shiva of the eastern land would assume Alva too came from the eastern land as well. This also plays into the role Easterners often assume in the wider geography of each game, as in Dark Souls 1 we learn Easterners often went on extraterritorial duties and were renowned for doing so successfully. In this, Alva may have been close to this saintly figure named Soretta, either from the Eastern Land or during an extraterritorial escapade, eventually vowing to cure her sickness. We learn from the Murakumo that Alva was extremely strong and dexterous and had built a reputation as a wayfaring knight who sought the spurned. Spurned, of course, means those who are rejected. Naturally, we would assume this would be more than likely related to hollows. However, it may actually relate to a certain witch that too was rejected by society and the order that Alva once represented. From the second game, we learn he would be entangled with a witch named Zully, someone initially posed to sabotage him on his knight's journey, only for them to find mutual respect for one another and reframe their purpose as one of mutual love. In Dark Souls 2, this is where the narrative ends, almost like a happily ever after. This may also explain why in Dark Souls 3, he has become a raging invader. The Locust Preacher in the DLC tells us once there was a wayfaring knight on an endless, forbidden search, likely related to Alva, who was resurrected amongst other Ashen ones to link the First Flame, but in his reborn state only wished one thing: to find the love of his life, Zully. Tragically, much time has passed between both games, and Zully was not reborn as an Ashen One, and thus his search was always going to be fruitless. Interestingly, we can find him near Carla's prison cell, likely assuming he sensed Zully's presence in the aesthetically and thematically similar Carla. Of course, Carla is not Zully, so this may be the moment he had lost hope. There is a theory that suggests Carla may be the daughter of Zully, and I'll go into this in further detail for her respective entry. We know undead who lose hope often turn to their inner darkness and embrace hollowing, and this is alluded to by the Locust Preacher, who tells us only the abyss granted him closure, if not reunion with his beloved. Fear not the dark, my friend. Little else is said about Alva. His story is notably tragic, so tragic his armor set even tells us troubadours sing tales of the wandering knight Alva and his travels, and of his involvement with the saint and the witch. Needless to say, the songs traditionally end in tragedy. There is seldom room for fairy tale romance in Dark Souls, but Alva and Zully stand out as a love that transcended time itself. Alva, eons after his life, after being reborn, wanted only one thing: to reconnect with the love of his life, the one that likely saw him to old age. Alva isn't an extremely powerful character. However, he is of course described as above the pale for ordinary warriors, and his travels despite his relationship with Zully are still commemorated as great, but his tale of tragic romance have obscured any true details of his combat victories. As he carries a weapon once associated to the incredibly powerful Easterner known as Shiva from the first game, it does also assume he stood as a member of the Easterner's most powerful warriors, enough so the Murakumo now is only remembered as Alva's weapon, and thus in a way Alva does stand adjacent to Shiva, and it's for this reason Alva ranks here on the list. We learn from the Black Hand armor set that only 3 warriors would receive the title of Black Hand. We learn the Black Hands were more accurately referred to as the King's Black Hands, the black prefix likely related to the nature of their duties related to the kingdom, the armor indicating they acted in the cover of darkness, likely relating them to espionage or assassinations. We're told only few would be considered for the Black Hand title. Once honoured in this fashion, they would be fiercely loyal, often accountable to serving several generations of kings. We aren't told a lot about Gotthard, but what we do know is he was originally a member of Lothric's knightly order, and according to his twin swords, rose quickly through knighthood, going on to contextualize this as no surprise to those who have witnessed his swordsmanship. This also indicates the Black Hands were often characterized by their swordplay. From the context for Kamui later in the list, we learned this swordsmanship would often represent itself as a mastery over twin swords. When watching Gotthard fight, it's clear he swings his blades in a manner similar to the Knights of Lothric, suggesting he may have been a contemporary of the Knights before rising to his position as an esteemed hunter. In this, and unlike Kamui, it's assumed Gotthard had a strong sense of patriotism far before his appointment as a Black Hand, something evidenced by his unique emote, almost seemingly like a general rallying his troops. Through this, we learn Gotthard felt a close affinity to Osiris while he was still king. Various descriptions suggest Osiris carried Lothric's tradition of shouldering the burden of the fire-linking tradition, something evidenced as Osiris took every measure to ensure his offspring bear the capacity to become a new Lord of Cinder. Of course, we know after Prince Lothric's birth and his innate disability, Osiris would desperately attempt to find a new means of honouring this tradition, eventually leading him down a path to becoming the consumed king, looking over the delusion of a third child named Ocelot, a story already covered in the Dark Souls 3 video. After Osiris' exile from his throne, we learn the twin princes, through manipulation from Sullivan or potentially their own volition, chose against linking the first flame, causing the stagnation of the cycle and the premise for the game itself. Naturally, Gotthard, being a patriot first, inducted into his role during Osiris' tenure, more than likely saw the twin princes' actions as treasonous to the founding principles of the nation of Lothric. In this, he would eventually abandon his duty as a hunter, aligned to the current twin prince rulers, and made it his role that the twin princes were toppled and Lothric's culture of fire-linking restored. This is precisely why Gotthard is conveniently located near the Pontiff and Abyss Watcher's boss battle, as both stood in the way towards confronting the twin princes and consolidating a new heir of fire. Gotthard would also find an ally with the High Priestess Emma, as she too wanted the same thing. However, eventually we find Gotthard dead in the Grand Archives, seemingly assassinated in transit. We get more context as to how this happened with Kamui's entry, but without spoiling that entry, we learn Kamui was also a Black Hand. But there are clues to indicate Kamui may have been the newest addition to the Black Hand tradition, as we are told he came to Lothric not as a human patriotic to the nation, but rather an undead afflicted mercenary from the Eastern lands, a place renowned for great swordsmen, and Kamui was one of their best. We're told in Lothric, Kamui, likely having steadily built a reputation as a great hunter, would be recruited by what is inferred to be the twin princes to the Black Hand rank, but his blade, specifically the Obidachi, suggesting he was granted this role for one specific act, to oppose the High Priestess Emma's treason and by extension, Gotthard's too. We know this as Seoul scholar Loki finds that the word Obodachi is loosely translated to Old Woman Slayer or Severer, which suggests Kamui was recruited directly by the twin princes as they had been made privy to Emma's actions, which ultimately explains why Gotthard is found dead at the archives with what seems to be Kamui's weapons laying beside him. Kamui assassinated the assassin and bested Gotthard at the final hurdle. Regardless of this, it's clear Gotthard was the greatest Lothric knight as he was one of the original two Black Hands coronated as worthy amongst the ranks. We even learn he didn't do this through a tenuous career, but rather did so quickly and to the surprise of no one, indicating even his comrades knew Gotthard was built different. The Lothric knightly tradition is immensely powerful. As the reigning hegemonic order, they paralleled even the Silver Knights of Anor Londo, and despite Osiris' exile and the fracturing of Lothric's control, their presence is still the most prominent, and as Gotthard stands as the epitome of this power, he ranks here on the list. Following from Gotthard's story, we learn Kamui was one of the three Black Hand hunters honoured by the Kingdom of Lothric, and from what we discussed in Gotthard's entry, we learned the Black Hand hunters were a very exclusive faction of warriors dedicated to assassination and espionage, often working in the shadows. While we're never given the identity of the third Black Hand hunter, we know a majority of this class of hunters were loyal to the Lothric bureaucracy and poached from the regular knightly order to a higher calling, one that required a distinctly powerful use of twin swords. While Gotthard rose the ranks quickly in a traditional way, we learn Kamui joined the ranks in a much more unorthodox way. Kamui originates likely from the east, sharing heritage with other Easterners including Shiva and potentially even Alon. We know Easterners were an incredibly talented culture of warriors, using blades in a distinct and highly effective way. Shiva's own journey found him rise the echelons of the Forest Hunter Covenant, traverse Blighttown, and potentially even brought the Chaos Blade into the game. Alon revolutionized the old Iron King's kingdom, creating a cohort of knights so powerful their weapons and fighting style remained in the universe eons after the events of the second game. In a similar fashion, Kamui, even before reaching Lothric, had already gained incredible notoriety as a merciless killer. From the blade Onikiri, which loosely translates to Onislayer, Oni referring to demons in Japanese, it's clear he would, even in his own homeland, gain a reputation as a demon slayer. Of course, we know demons in the Souls universe are uniquely related to Izalith, but may symbolically also refer to non-human entities or even giants. The description of this weapon tells us Kamui brought Onikiri with him to the undead settlement, once again affirming he had already accrued this reputation before entering the land. Unsurprisingly, Kamui would cut his way through a great portion of the area, so well that even the twin princes who now resided over Lothric as their royal ruler would acknowledge his existence as strong enough to use for their own means. As we've discussed in the entry for Gotthard, we learned these means were related to using Kamui to undo Emma and Gotthard's transgressions. The description of his blade tells us he would enter the undead settlement with only his Onikiri and eventually forge Obodachi, better known as the Old Woman Slayer. And upon the creation of this blade, he was finally prepared to take on the task the twin princes had assigned him. We learn he would swiftly act on his duties and face off against Emma's closest confidants, this of course being Gotthard and us, the player. Kamui would defeat Gotthard in a decisive victory at the gates of the Grand Archives, and later position himself between us and the Twin Princes, ready to once again act on his duty and service to his new boss. We aren't told a lot about Kamui outside of these events, but rarely does the game assign such a great degree of power to an individual character like Kamui. We learn he was distinguished as a demon slayer in the Great Eastern Lands, a place second to none for great warriors, described in the first game as always intentional in their journeys and often the most successful in extraterritorial matters. This, combined with Kamaway's quick rise to the Black Hand, suggests even the great twin princes, just on his reputation, saw within Kamaway a powerful enough being that he could undo the transgressions of another Black Hand in Gotthard, who in his own right was an incredibly powerful swordsman at the top of the Lothric Knightly Order. For this reason, Kamaway ranks here on the list. Creighton's a pretty interesting entry on this list, as dependent on the canonical end to his questline in the second game, we know he either survives Pate or is killed by him in Seldora. However, it's clear debating this may be a futile endeavour, as there is very little to be said about the events following Dark Souls 2 in the descriptions and stories of Dark Souls 3. For this reason, it may be easier to assume Creighton was reborn just like us as a worthy Ashen One to attempt linking the first flame. To summarise Creighton's story in Dark Souls 2, he was a travelling warrior suggested to be from Mirror, but item descriptions tell us his Moraean armour may be false or modified heavily. Our first assumption is that he is hiding a secret. Kale suggests this secret is his identity as a infamous Moraean serial killer, something we hypothesised in the last video as potentially false and a ploy devised by Pate, who shared more in common with Kale to begin with, notably a specific regional accent. In this, Creighton may have modified non-Moraean armour to seem Moraean for some degree of warrior clout, something reinforced in the second installment as his supposed weapon seems to be one that belonged to a famous warrior under the name of Lothian from Ferosa and harboured a lightning quality, something Creighton in Dark Souls 2 does not have when he swings his weapon, suggesting just like his armour, the weapon was a replica or an imitation. So why is he in Dark Souls 3? As mentioned, it's likely he was reborn as an Ashen One, but that doesn't entirely explain the nature of our encounter with Creighton, as in Dark Souls 3, specifically the description of his armor and weapon, it seems the descriptive narrator of the game demonstrates some degree of historical revisionism, likely as a result of how much time has gone by since the events of the second game. The description of the Dragonslayer axe in Dark Souls 3 tells us this was a weapon that belonged to a Knight of Mirror, and how, despite its lightning affinity, Creighton used it to slay men. His armor also tells us that it was the formal, honourable attire for the Knights of Mirror. We know from a point of having lived through the events of Dark Souls 2 that both of these accounts are entirely incorrect. Firstly, we learn from Kael, Lucatil and Aslatil that Moraean armour looked very different to Creighton's chainmail, something clearly altered to seem more Moraean to begin with. Secondly, we learn the Dragonslayer axe held by Creighton in the second installment did not belong to Mirror, as axes were far away from the Moraean tradition of swordsmanship. We also know this axe rightfully belonged first to Lothian of Ferosa, not Creighton seemingly of Mirror. But in Dark Souls 3, Creighton swings his blade with lightning, so how do we explain this? While I will say there is room for a lot of speculation here, I believe Creighton, at the end of the trilogy, testament to his wandering and unwavering spirit, somehow self-actualized himself as everything he initially aspired to be. There are no Moraeans left in this world, but Creighton, dressing as a Moraean, ironically superseded them in history, and this may be why the world thus modelled what they thought of Mirror on Creighton himself. He possesses the Dragonslayer axe now with the lightning affinity too, having superseded even Lothian of Ferosa's legacy as well, another testament to the sheer power held by Creighton in this new world. Our final clue as to how powerful Creighton would become is in Cirrus's questline, where he is now a member of Rosaria's Covenant invading Cirrus. A majority of the time we don't intervene, Creighton absolutely decimates Cirrus all on his own, and the game even suggests we have to aid Cirrus in order for her to overcome Creighton here. And while I don't want to use gameplay as a metric, it's clear the story is painted out to suggest Creighton, the aggressor, is going to assassinate Cirrus if we don't intervene. In this, Creighton, a once gullible man fooled of his own good nature by Pate, ultimately outlasted his former nemesis and proved himself far beyond a thief, and in his new bout of life demands the world remember his name even without the clout once associated to a culture now forgotten by the world and a warrior now lost to time too. For this, Creighton the Wanderer ranks here on the list. Leonard is one of the most prolific members of Rosaria's covenant, known as her Fingers. As we've learned from Rosaria's entry, Rosaria was likely the queen of Drang Lake, transformed when her holy maiden Gertrude was enlightened by a supposed angel. We learn the angel was not of divinity, rather from Londor, and with a message of humanity and darkness. A message both Gertrude and Rosaria would embrace, causing them to be outcasted by the Lothric bureaucracy, eventually leading to the imprisonment and mutilation of Rosaria. Rosaria, finding a new home in the Church of the Deep, would spread her gospel and encourage her so-called Fingers to seek out tongues as a chance at regaining her own, one that she lost to her eldest son after he became privy to her heresy. While we have discussed Rosaria's Fingers in previous entries, we learned the titles they would hold would be relative to their position and affinity to Rosaria herself. In this, Leonard, her most vocal ally, would be referred to as her ring finger. We know from our own real-world context that ring fingers are often associated with loyalty, with wedding rings, purity rings, and promise rings, all made for ring fingers. In this, his title, Ring Finger, would indicate amongst the covenant, Leonard was the most faithful to Rosaria herself. But how did Leonard get here, and what relevance does his story have to his overall strength? Well, we learn Leonard was born into royalty, his armor set outright suggesting his associations to royal blood. We aren't given much context as to what royal family he descends from or the nature of the royal family and their association to godhood, and things are made more difficult as his armor set doesn't point towards a certain knightly discipline found elsewhere in the game. We do, however, know he shares a striking parallel to Lautrec, not only in his weaponry, but also in his obsession with a certain goddess. We know Lautrec venerated the goddess known as Fina, a deity associated to Anolondo that later fled to Karim, an area which would become synonymous with a variety of deities looking to re-establish themselves. While Leonard doesn't share the same affiliations with Karim or Fina, he does venerate Rosaria as his goddess, so much so that he would be obsessed with recruiting for the Covenant and staying close to his queen. We're also given context as to how he would come to worship Rosaria, as we are told long ago he would face severe scolding, disfiguring his face and forcing him to don a silver mask to hide the scars. It's likely the scolding would cause him to be outcasted from whatever royal family he had been associated with. We know royalty are often acknowledged due to their position of authority under the hegemony of the Age of Fire, and it wouldn't be surprising if we found out his royal bloodline was beholden to the Age of Fire too. Naturally, after being exiled, he would build a disdain towards nobility, and consequently, upon his journey to find rebirth, he would find Rosaria, yet another noble forced into exile by the powers of the Age of Fire. Unsurprisingly, he felt an affinity towards her, and despite his wounds, he would never rebirth himself even though Rosaria had the power to do so, as it's likely he felt the wounds on his face were a reminder of the Age of Fire's discrimination, and he would instead carry the wounds in pride and as mutual respect to the disfigurement of Rosaria. By the time we join the Covenant, it's likely he is the most tenured and is responsible for recruiting others. So fierce was his loyalty, Rosaria herself would grant him the Crescent Moon Blade, a blade that hosts within it the power of the Dark Moon associated to Gwyndolin. No doubt this was an heirloom of Rosaria's due to her affiliation to Guinevere, sister to Gwyndolin. Leonard's obsession would eventually turn to us, and eventually he would hold antagonisms towards us as we came closer to Rosaria, either fearing our ulterior motives or out of pure jealousy. In this, he would preemptively capture Rosaria's soul, a soul that did not signify her death, rather the preservation of her spirit to be reborn again. Mirroring Lautrec's mission to undermine Guinevere and slay a Firekeeper, we can find a Black Eye Orb as we progress his questline, an orb usually left at the site of an important death, something we can use to avenge Rosaria's preemptive demise. Usually these orbs are related to the death of a Firekeeper or key maiden of the Age of Fire. Naturally, due to Rosaria's heritage affiliated to Guinevere, this would also be dropped here too. We can invade Leonard at a chance at retrieving Rosaria's unkillable soul, interestingly in Anor Londo, in Guinevere's old bedchamber, once again mirroring Lautrec. In this event, Leonard holds the Crescent Moon Sickle, and has the ability to cast adept sorceries, potentially giving a clue to his origins as a sorcerer, and potentially linked to a spellcasting tradition. His use of the sickle is important as he can take full advantage of the Dark Moon power it held, assuming he may have gained a great degree of power in proximity to Rosaria, and not only inherited her blade, but also inherited her affinity to the Dark Moon as well. We know the Dark Moon is an incredibly potent tradition of sorcery, something even the great Pontiff Sullivan sought to harness himself to overpower the Age of Fire. We know being a prolific member of Rosaria's Covenant requires a plethora of invasions and hunts, and while he doesn't have the clout of Longfinger Kirk, long to indicate most reach and potentially most victims, he does host within him a power other characters could only dream to wield. Ultimately placing Ringfinger Leonard here on the list, a mirror of the once god-favoured Lautrec, as he too was god-favoured, not by Fina, but by Rosaria of Guinevere's divinity. Sir Wilhelm is a man of few words. Our first encounter with him makes it clear he is heavily allied to Sister Frida, standing outside her place of residence and having clearly followed her through her own journey. Of course, we know Sister Frida, or previously known as Elfrida, as one of the three sisters who founded the Sable Church under the tutelage of Darkstalker Karth. Elfrida, the eldest of the three, was also the most impatient and ambitious of the sisters, once taking it upon herself to contest the First Flame and seek its usurpation. We learn she acted quite briskly and ultimately failed in her mission, dying at the hands of what is likely the soul of Cinder. Fortunately, however, she would be reborn as an Ashen One to once again attempt the First Flame. Instead, she was filled with apathy towards the cycle and fled to the Painted World, seeking a new path and renouncing her allegiance to the Sable Church on seemingly good terms. Sir Wilhelm, as we are told, was a knight who served closely all three sisters of the Sable Church, but his blade suggests he held the closest affinity to the eldest sister. We're told Elfrida herself referred to him as her own knight, indicating he may have had a right-hand position with Elfrida. We even know he would adopt the moniker the Cold-Blooded Hangman, suggesting he was active in protecting her and killing those who opposed her. After her death, we aren't told what Wilhelm would do, but his dialogue suggests he would remain within the Sable Church, serving Uria. However, after Elfrida was resurrected, Wilhelm would track her down, only to be told by Elfrida that she has renounced the Sable Church and relieved Wilhelm of his duties by granting him her onyx blade, something described as a farewell gift. The nature of the Sable Church sisters being swordswomen and Uria holding a unique blade of her own suggests the onyx blade may have been Elfrida's own symbolic blade related to the Sable Church, so she may have seen Wilhelm as powerful enough to retain her legacy in the church and wield her own blade while he did so, suggesting his power somewhat adjacent to her own. However, we learn despite this, Wilhelm followed Elfrida to the Painted World and had also renounced his allegiance to the Sable Church to stick around Elfrida, something Elfrida, now known as Frida, didn't even acknowledge, suggesting he did so without her even knowing. As we will learn in Uria's entry, the Sable Church were an incredibly powerful institution, which were primarily built from the power of the three sisters, Elfrida, Uria, and Liliane. It's clear Sir Wilhelm may have been second only to the leading sisters, and his use of Elfrida's weapon suggests he sufficiently carried her legacy. When he confronts us, he affirms his suspicions of our intentions with Frida and preemptively seeks our assassination, giving us an image of what his role would have looked like under Elfrida's time as a sister of the Sable Church, utilising the dark of the Onyx Blade as if it were his own. It's clear Sir Wilhelm is the projected shadow of Elfrida during her time as a leading figurehead at the Sable Church, and while we'll go into much more detail on the gravity of the power associated to the Sable Church in Uria's entry, Wilhelm firmly ranks here on the list. Nightslayer Sorig is an entry that hones together many great aspects from both the second installment but also the first installment too. We meet him deep within the smouldering lake beside a pit of fire, almost waiting in ambush. From his armor, it's clear Sorig has a story far richer than just being a warrior, as his armor is identical to the one famously worn by Black Iron Tarkus, the single greatest Berenique knight and one of a few successful challengers to Sen's fortress. So how did Sorig get his armor, and why is its descriptive context only referencing Sorig? Well, this thread leads us to his name, Nightslayer. We learn from his ring that he was commonly known as a Night Slayer, suggesting the world, at least in general knowledge, had famed him as a knight great at defeating other knights. While the easiest assumption would be to suggest Sorig murdered Tarkus for his attire, we know the timelines between the first and last game are eons apart, and we know Tarkus didn't die at the hands of another knight, rather did so by falling off the rafters in Anor Londo. Thus, it's more likely that Sorig obtained the armor through one of his ever so famous knight-killing expeditions, especially once Tarkus' armor had been recuperated by another knight that would eventually fall to Sorig himself. This isn't too far of a stretch either, as we learn from Dark Souls 2 that the steel set of the Berenique can be found adorned by an invader named Rockshield Boulder, a character conveniently located near the Grave Robber boss battle. As we know Shulva would become a great burial ground for legendary warriors, it may not be too far a stretch to assume someone had salvaged Tarkus' armor from here, or potentially Sorig himself came here to claim the prize himself. Understandably, many would argue Dark Souls 2 happened far before Dark Souls 3, so this wouldn't make any sense. But we already know from a variety of characters already assessed on this list that Dark Souls 2 and characters directly from Dark Souls 2 make a reappearance as reborn Ashen Ones in this game. A further note to this is the fact that Sorig in particular also wields items directly related to the other three great DLC areas of Dark Souls 2, the most prominent being the Fume Ultra Greatsword, but also the Nightslayer Ring, clearly a renaming of the Ivory Warrior Ring. The Fume Ultra Greatsword is another highly mysterious item that Sorig wields. While once again we can assume this was through a direct battle with Raim claiming the blade for himself, there is truly too little context around Sorig, but also far too little outright strength attributed to Sorig that would place him adjacent to the Fume Knight himself. In a similar instance, it may be the case that Sorig laid claim to this weapon once it had been passed down as a legendary heirloom of Raim to another great knight, eventually coming into the possession of Sorig through a successful battle. While explaining the Fume Greatsword and Tarkus' armor require some degree of contextual world building, Sorig's possession of the Ivory Warrior Ring as the Nightslayer Ring has a description that outright tells us how he obtained it. It tells us, long ago, Sorig engaged the guardians of an ancient city in a bloody confrontation and returned with their rings as his prize, still frozen on their dismembered fingers. Not only explaining exactly how he obtained this ring, but also giving us context about how he obtained his armor and weapon too, by brute force and, as his name suggests, slaying knights. Having brought back a significant aspect of Shulva, Eleum Lois, and even the Broom Tower, Sorig would go on to become a significant threat to others, challenging knights throughout the game to continue his spree. We know Eleum Lois was governed by what is likely the most noble and hardened warriors in the entire Dark Souls 2 universe, and potentially the entire series too. Born in Ferosa, hardened by their devotion to the god of war, and consolidated in history as loyal even in their last breaths. It's no surprise the only mention of Sorig's great campaign against the Three Kingdoms of Dark Souls 2 is that of Eleum Lois, the place with the greatest knights, overshadowing both Nadalia's and even Ilana's territory. The Burnt Ivory King was by far the greatest boss in Dark Souls 2. His knights were fashioned from his image, and thus Sorig, as a being that literally tore their rings from their hands, is a feat that should not be underestimated. How he has survived up until the third installment is not entirely clear. He may be an Ashen One or even a great enough being to have withstood time. But one thing is for certain, he is the embodiment of our players' great journey through the DLCs of Dark Souls 2, an embodiment of all of their knightly traditions coming back with a vengeance in the Smouldering Lake. In this, Sorig is the ultimate representation of the great crowns of Dark Souls 2. It's no wonder only he was able to bring to life Tarkus's armor and, in his death, reclaimed the notoriety of the armor based on his actions alone, disconnected from the famous Tarkus. The armor no longer has any descriptions of Tarkus, only Sorig, and thus Sorig ranks here on the list. We have previously spoken about another student of the Great Crystal Sages in the entry for Yellowfinger Hazel. However, we learn her time as a student was short-lived, and while the sages took interest in her raw ability to devise spells, they did require great refining from the sages themselves. On the other hand, we learn of a character named Kremhild, described outright by the sages' crystal staff as the Crystal Sage's favourite pupil. Understanding Kremhild's true power thus requires a quick overview of the Crystal Sages and the story of the Preacher Twins. We're told the Crystal Sages, originally known as the Preacher Twins, were heavily inspired by the works of Big Hat Logan. We learn much before even arriving in Lothric, the twins had already reached the pinnacle of Crystal Soul sorcery associated to Logan, and even made contemporary improvements to the art itself. An art so deeply powerful, almost every other being that would come remotely close to the level of Logan would go insane from the knowledge alone. However, it's likely the Preacher Twins had devised sensory tools that allowed them to supersede the negative consequences, something later refined in the Grand Archives as head waxing. Having ventured into Lothric, the twins would quickly rise to fame within Lothric's bureaucracy and brought with them the gospel associated with Logan's teachings. This may be the reason they held the Preacher Twin moniker. The Preacher Twins would eventually go on to become one of the most influential members of the Lothric bureaucracy and be granted the Grand Archives to further their studies, something likely pushed by King Osiris's personal fascination with the Crystal Sages and study into dragons associated within this tradition, something that would eventually transform him into a mutated hybrid. While it's likely the Crystal Sages initially looked over the Grand Archives together, we learn one of the twins would set off and join the Undead Legion of Farron, going on to develop Farron sorcery, something detailed in Hazel's entry. However, before the Preacher Twins would separate, we learned they would both take to a sorcerer named Kremhild. Item descriptions indicate the Preacher Twins saw within Kremhild what they saw in themselves, this being the capacity to not only master Logan's sorceries, but make use of crystals far beyond all others. The Sage's Crystal Staff tells us a gift from the Crystal Sages to their favourite pupil Kremhild. Crystal spheres devour the will of the user. As Kremhild was granted this specifically, it would indicate the Crystal Sages knew she could handle the crystal's temperament, something we know she did in our own encounter with her. More context is given when we learn the Crystal Sage's staff was likely not a collective gift from both twins, but specifically from the sage associated to Farron, who clearly exhibits more spell variety with the use of a crystal ball, taking us to her other weapon, the Crystal Rapier, a weapon described as used by the Crystal Sages for self-defense. Her use of this blade may indicate the sage in the Grand Archives gifted her his own rapier, and thus both the sage's crystal staff but also the sage's rapier indicate both the Preacher Twins offered a unique aspect of themselves to Kremhild to celebrate her position as a master of both of their unique teachings. Naturally, we see this mastery in a battle against her, as she can utilize a variety of crystal spells, including Crystal Hail, Crystal Soul Spear, and Homing Crystal Soul Mass, all spells described as the quintessence of sorcery, indicating she, much like the Preacher Twins, had reached the zenith of the tradition, no doubt explaining why the twins saw her as their favourite pupil amongst the hundreds of scholars associated to the archives, but also the legionaries in Farron too. We know Crystal Soul Sorcery is described in the first game as mirroring the power of the Primordial Lords, and no doubt this was due to Gwyn's own soul being attributable to the power of Seath, and thus his Crystal Sorcery too. The Crystal Sages in the boss ranked video are one of the greater enemies in the game, accountable to Osiris' transformation into a hybrid of Seath, but also for the first time in the game, beings that stood on Logan's shoulders and did so to incredibly powerful positions while retaining their individuality. We know one of the sages' presence in Farron would reshape the means in which the Legion conducted combat, another testament to their power and influence. But beside this all, Kremhild was the best aspects of both sages, carrying items to indicate the mastery over Farron's Crystal Soul Sorcery, but also the meticulous power of the Crystal Sage in the Grand Archives, placing her adjacent to her tutors and thus ranking here on the list. We briefly discussed Hodrick in Cyrus's entry. Of course, naturally this was related to Cyrus being Hodrick's granddaughter and thus Hodrick her grandfather. In that particular entry, we spoke about Hodrick's previous allegiance being related to the Darkmoon Covenant, tied intimately with Anor Londo's authority. While we learned Cyrus took to the family tradition quite well and integrated herself deeply with what remained of the Darkmoon Covenant under the tutelage of Company Captain Yorshka, Hodrick, while initially too taking to this authority well, and descriptions from Cyrus's entry indicating he may have originated the family's reputation as some of the most well-known Darkmoon Knights, he would eventually, as many Hollows who live beyond their years would, become skeptical around the nature of the Anor Londo project and the nature of humanity itself. We know Hodrick would become apathetic to the Darkmoon Covenant through the descriptions of the Moundmaker Covenant, a separate covenant seemingly developed and entrenched in the world through his own actions. The description of the vertebrae item tells us it unshackles humans from the influence of gods, drawing a deep parallel to the submission to Gwyndolin, a deity in his own right, to looking to unshackle all divine influence by literally severing vertebrae from humans, parts of their body that is suggested to be a link between human and god, and thus a tool for subjugation by divine entities. The role of the Moundmaker's Covenant, both in gameplay practice and lore specifics, relates heavily to defeating other members of deific factions and separating them by force from their divine allegiances. With the spare vertebrae, they would accumulate and pile them in mounds, which were ironically altar-like. We aren't told of any deity the Moundmakers specifically revered, but we do know their place of operations is called the Pit of Hollows. Further context from Hodrick indicates the practice of divine severance may also relate to retaining one's own sanity, which would assume the hollowed state was seen to be a curse caused by the gods, which, as we know, is actually true, but the practice of divine severance would hold little practical value to keeping one from going hollow, outside of giving a twisted purpose that in itself would retain one's humanity. When we think about the strength of Hodrick, we have to place him close to the overall presence the Moundmakers were able to make in the game under his tutelage. We are told by the description of the weapon known as Bloodlust that the Covenant's success and presence may be related to a person known as the original Moundmaker. We get more clues as to the identity of this so-called Moundmaker when we read further, which iterates a story of leaving behind an heirloom for his family, but also being the final sacrifice. We know the Covenant is far from giving their final sacrifice when we first join the Covenant, and we also know Hodrick, more than any other character in the game, has a deep familial history in the game, from his wife being a handmaiden, his granddaughter being Cyrus, and dialogue to indicate a continued fondness between all figures despite their separate allegiances. In this, it can be argued Hodrick himself was in fact the first Moundmaker, and the blade Bloodlust was his primary weapon. The weapon art related to this weapon tells us the wielder's Bloodlust was frenzied, something that lines up with Cyrus's own dialogue about the nature of her grandfather since he turned away from the Darkmoon Covenant. We aren't given a lot of detail around who was a part of this covenant, but we know that Altar is probably the game's most extensive pile of dead bodies. And as we know these bodies were often accumulated by force, we have to reasonably assume these were a result of Hodrick's rampage conjured by a bloodlust he may have accumulated in the early days of leaving the Darkmoon Covenant. We also know Hodrick was no pushover, not only from the description of his weapon, but also from the fact that Cyrus's heritage seems to trail all the way back to Hodrick and no further, once again suggesting Hodrick began his career of killing at the Darkmoon Covenant and worked his way far up the ranks of Gwendolyn's secret police force, that he would eventually build a name not just for himself, but for his family too, something that still holds credence despite him leaving on bad terms, as Cyrus still retains a premier position within the Darkmoon Covenant. This paints the picture of the Darkmoon Covenant's greatest human warrior, a warrior who one day found within one of his victims a vertebrae shackle, and this revelation would spur within him an internal inquiry, one that would lead him to the influence of the gods, eventually renouncing his own faith and dedicating not just himself, but a cohort of others to a blood-hungry campaign murdering thousands, if not tens of thousands of people, eventually building from the ground up the Pit of Hollows, a place so detestable to the gods, it became the one place in the world the gods truly had no influence in. This may also be attributable to the curse-rotted Greatwood's presence here. Something we learned was the accumulation of dead souls reanimated in a great tree, a spirit tree of lost souls, something we never see anywhere else in the game, testament to the sheer scale of the Covenant's killings. It's no surprise the final act for Cyrus is to put down her father, as what more could be the ultimate task of a Darkmoon warrior than to exact punishment to a blasphemer? Something she cannot do alone, and something she only seeks to do once we have proven our allegiance to her in other parts of the game. Hodrick is a man with a history in one of the most prestigious covenants in the entire game, the secret police force of Anor Londo itself, and assuming from his age this was during Gwendolyn's own premiership. We learn he would climb the ranks so high his family would continue to reap the reputational benefits long after his blasphemous exit. Not slowing down, Hodrick, after leaving the Covenant, would build himself as adjacent to Gwendolyn himself in his own Covenant, one that put him adjacent to every other authority in the game, choosing to kill practically anyone with the prospect of pulling from humanity the shackles of the gods themselves. His legacy would go down as one of bloodlust upon a mound of death and destruction. While other anti-theistic figures in the game such as Sullivan, Aldrich, the Sisters of Londor, and even us come with an elaborate means of changing the world, Hodrick didn't seek a usurpation of power. Rather, it was a vengeful campaign to undermine godly authority altogether, not to replace them. In this, he didn't channel the power of gods or souls and miracles, rather just the brute power of humans and careful swordsmanship. The bloodless weapon is a pretty basic weapon. It has no enchantments or infusions. It relies purely on human strength and the bleed effect. Testament to Hodrick's power and pure determination alone, placing him far above the pale and ranking here on the list. As many of you would remember from my first video in the series, Kirk's story goes far back to the beginning of the game and at the precipice of the game's primary dialectic, the antithetical forces of the Dark Soul finally raging against Gwyn's thesis with the goal of synthesizing the rightful age of Dark. Kirk, in the first notable moments of his life, would find himself within the company of the first rank of Dark Wraiths, directly associated with the Four Kings, and thus he was there when Karth bestowed upon them and his warriors the art of life drain. These warriors would begin to build a force powerful enough to challenge even Anor Londo, as they were now able to violently gather humanity, but also militarize it against the Age of Fire. We learn the power of the Dark Wraiths were becoming so great, Gwyn, upon gaining intelligence that the Four Kings had turned on him, would preemptively destroy New Londo by flooding the land, banishing the Four Kings, but also the Dark Wraiths. This action wouldn't entirely subdue the Dark Wraiths, as a few would escape New Londo and in their dwindled state still act as a counterweight to the primary policing force of the Age of Fire in the form of the Darkmoon Covenant. Testament to the power of Dark Wraiths, but also the art of life drain, Dark Wraiths would even persevere despite a fully resourced campaign to undermine them by the residing hegemonic powers, and as we have learned, they would go on to redevelop New Londo in the third installment in the form of Londor and the Sable Church, their new home, one that celebrated the Hollows and is even accountable to an ending in the game that sees them overturn Gwyn's Age of Fire entirely. However, not all Dark Wraiths carried on New Londo's mission, as if we return to the events of the Flood, we find that a certain Dark Wraith described as infamous and powerful, even amongst his cohort of warriors, would abandon the mission first laid out by Karth. Unlike the Dark Wraiths from the first game, Kirk would find a new motivation, focusing his ability to invade and defeat others better than any of his comrades to a different cause of a similar premise as his original mission, to help the helpless, a clear extension of what grounded the philosophy of the Dark Wraiths to begin with. We aren't told where Kirk's post-New Londo ventures would take him, but the once uniquely decorated Dark Wraith renowned by the world as the Knight of Thorns would find himself at the foot of Izalith and in service of the Fair Lady, a woman much like the Hollows of the world, found blistered and mutated and at the behest of Gwyn's oppressive streak to undo any structure not fit for the Age of Fire. The Fair Lady, pushed into a corner of the world by Gwyn, gave her own life to alleviate the suffering of others who had been devastated by Izalith's mutation and Gwyn's campaign of extermination, holding on to dear life by honing humanity and maintaining a bonfire to help other Hollows with the rejuvenation of their own bodies. Kirk, knowing that he held within his hands an art that could sap humanity itself, but also the clear experience of invading and killing others, made it his primary objective to act just as he did as a Dark Wraith, but instead offer humanity to the Fair Lady to keep her alive. And as we discussed in the first video, Kirk's actions may be responsible for how the Fair Lady remained alive despite the death of her sister and protector, Quelaag. By the time we enter Dark Souls 3, we learn the Fair Lady has since been dead for what seems to be a long time, but Kirk remains alive, supporting the life of a different entity, Rosaria. As we learn from Rosaria's entry, her existence would be one of torture and abuse, her body, much like the Fair Lady, given away to others for rebirth, not dissimilar to how the Fair Lady took on Blightpus to soothe the pain of her residents. Naturally, Kirk would find a new purpose in preserving but also serving Rosaria, and from Archdeacon Kilmp's story in the game, it's clear Rosaria was offered comfort if we are able to bring her tongues only forcefully attainable through invasions, something Kirk was not unfamiliar with. Kirk would, just as he did for the Dark Wraiths and the Fair Lady, become incredibly efficient at invasions, rising the ranks to the very zenith of the Covenant very quickly. Our biggest indication for how powerful Kirk was is the ranking convention used by Rosaria's Covenant. We learn prefix titles were given to indicate how important an individual is to the Covenant. Naturally, Kirk would end up consolidating the most powerful position, the Longfinger title. Long to indicate most prominent, but also the furthest extension of Rosaria's influence. Kirk, through the eons of the game, constantly reminds us the sheer power and influence held by the Dark Wraith Covenant, but he also shows us why he, even amongst this elite group of warriors, stood as the most infamous. He proved himself to the Four Kings, he proved himself to the Fair Lady, and he proves himself to Rosaria, as not just the most powerful Dark Wraith, but also a selfless warrior refusing to die and wither away to history so long as there is a victim of oppression. Rarely are there characters that have their name present throughout the trilogy, but even rarer do they survive and continue to be influential too. In this, Dark Wraith, Chaos Servant, Longfinger, the Knight of Thorns Kirk ranks here on the list. Lado is another great example of how Dark Souls 3 carries the story of Dark Souls 1 to the final moments of the series. We learn from his armor that he held heritage to the old order of knights associated to Anor Londo. Of course, we know the main archetype of knights associated to Anor Londo were the Silver Knights and the later malformed Black Knights who fought against the old Chaos. We learn from the first game that a majority of the Silver Knights stood close to Anor Londo and loyally stood as buttresses for the city, specifically in Gwyn's absence and under the tutelage of Gwyndolin. In this, we learn Ledo may have been of the same cohort of warriors, his shield describing blessings from Gwyndolin too, indicating he may have served a great section of his tenure under Gwyndolин's authority, enough so that his shield still retains Gwyndolин's blessings. However, as you would expect based on his distinct naming, he was a little different to the usual tradition of Silver Knights. From the first game, we learn the Silver Knights often adorned intricate and slim weaponry. Straight swords, spears, and bows were commonplace for the tradition of warriors. Ledo, however, steered far away from this, adopting instead a great hammer described as by far the heaviest weapon amongst those wielded by the Knights of Anor Londo, placing him much closer to a different tradition of Gwyn's knights, those associated to the famous Duke Havel. We know Havel's round table of knights were venerated as incredibly elite even amongst Gwyn's first reign in the Age of Fire, Havel being adjacent to even lords in his contributions to the battle against the ancient everlasting dragons, even adopting their scales and teeth as armory of his own. Naturally, he would become renowned as an incredibly strong fighter, relying mostly on his strength to navigate his ambitions. While we don't know of Havel and Ledo's direct relationship, it's inferred that Havel would have great influence over Ledo's own fighting style, likely teaching Ledo his art of war, something that can be seen directly through the rock call skill associated to Ledo's hammer that eerily resembles Havel's rock form ability associated to his shield. Of course, we get a more clear description of their closeness from the description of his hammer, outlining an outright close friendship between Ledo and Havel too. Similarly to Havel, Ledo was a free spirit, openly diverging from the old traditions the Age of Fire relied heavily on to maintain their culturally hegemonic position in the world. Ledo, much like Havel, would eventually face challenges due to the tightening rigidity of Anor Londo's bureaucracy after Gwyn abandoned Anor Londo to sacrifice himself at the First Flame. The organised structure of power sought to retain tradition in a desperate plea to hold on to Gwyn's authority in a now Gwynless region. During this period, many gods of Gwyn's legion would bolster extreme theocratic positions, such as that of Thorolund under Lloyd and the existence of the Darkmoon Covenant under Gwyndolin, both likely responses to other gods abandoning Anor Londo and dismissing Gwyn's authority with the rise of a more clarified dialectic, namely the rise of the Dark, but also Velka's authority in the Painted World. In this, it's likely Ledo's unorthodox position in the Silver Knight Order would have him under some degree of scrutiny that would eventually transpire into Ledo leaving Anor Londo entirely and embarking on a journey of his own, one that likely saw him following Artorias' legacy and facing off against Darkwraiths, which is alluded to by the location in which we meet him. Ledo's hammer, testament to its description, is, from a gameplay perspective, the heaviest weapon in the entire game, requiring the most amount of strength to wield. In this, Ledo stands as not just a spiritual progression of Havel, something we become familiar with in the series, but rather a contemporary to Havel, whom Havel himself felt comfortable passing knowledge onto and even developing a close friendship with. In this, Ledo, adjacent to Havel, stands tall as not only one of the final few Silver Knights still standing, but a projection of Havel's influence carried to the literal end of the universe itself, solidifying his position here on the list. Piggybacking off of the entry for Yol is the Stone-Humped Hag. While there isn't too much to say about this entry as we initially meet her, it's her ultimate form that really paints a picture of power, eclipsing what we previously knew of the pilgrims already spoken of during Yol's entry. As a brief recap, we learn Londor became host to a variety of unique beings and characters, from the ruling Three Sisters all the way to the Paleshade Assassins. The Sable Church, accepting Hollowing with pride, would have their culture take a drastic departure from the cultures influenced by the hegemony of the Age of Fire. And as the Age of Fire began to dim and the ashes of countless cycles began to take a toll on the cycle itself, Londor would stand to form a bipolar world system and the threat and influence of Londor would be the single most prominent projection of the Dark and the mission Karth once started in Ulasil many eons ago. As we learned from Yoel's entry, the Pilgrims of Londor were missionaries sent from Londor on a mission to die and be reborn in Lothric as angelic figures used to influence the nation of Lothric. Of course, we learn from Rosaria that many would go on and succeed to transform Lothric from the inside out by acting as messengers to the malleable authorities within Lothric, such as that of Queen Rosaria herself. However, the Stonehumped Hag's mission was discreetly different to that of the original pilgrims who sought a death to become angel missionaries in Lothric. Rather, she was a hag that is distinctly described as affiliated with royalty. She is described by her ashes as a wet nurse to royalty. And while we can't say for certain what royal family this was, there is a compelling theory suggesting this wet nurse may be related to the Lothric royal family and associated to Rosaria's initial revelations. The only being we know that is altogether tied to the wet nurses, Rosaria, and the pilgrims is, of course, the incredibly elusive character named Gertrude. We are told Gertrude was a maiden of Rosaria. Naturally, maidens often accompany their queens in their day-to-day affairs, and it wouldn't be a stretch to assume Gertrude as the primary maiden that fulfilled this role too. This would also explain how Gertrude was able to influence Rosaria so deeply. While in the base game we never learn of what happened to Gertrude, we find out exactly what actually did happen when we meet the Stonehumped Hag, especially as she transforms into a pilgrim butterfly, with powers that eerily resemble the divine Pillars of Light miracle, which holds the description, "The Queen's holy maiden Gertrude was visited by an angel who revealed this tale to her." Gertrude and the angels associated to the Ring City are distinctly far more powerful than the ones in Lothric, and I believe this is intentional in the lore, as it's very likely the angels of Lothric that visited Gertrude spurred within her the combined power of both the miracles of Lothric with the power of Londor, creating the angelic spells of both factions. The Divine Pillars of Light are the synthesis between the ailing Age of Fire and the darkness at the heart of Londor, a power that beckoned the beginning of a new era, something that held importance in the Ring City. The Stonehumped Hag, whom we now know as Gertrude, tells us, at the close of the Age of Fire, all lands meet at the end of the earth. Great kingdoms and anemic townships will be one in the same, further suggesting the symbolism of a great dialectical synthesis happening in the Ring City, represented by the angelic powers of the angels within the Ring City too. We know the revelations conducted by the angels and thus the angelic faith of Lothric would be an incredibly powerful force in influencing Lothric's political state, enough to send the nation into a civil conflict. In this, the Stonehumped Hag is not only the personification of the power of Lothric's faith and the power of the Sable Church, but also the nature of the Ring City during the single most crucial point of the timeline, placing the Stonehumped Hag far beyond what we expect from a withered old lady. From the first list, we learn that pyromancy is a direct derivative of the ancient spellcasting tradition sourced from the power of Izalith before her transformation into chaos. This power was equivalent only to Nito's miasma and Gwyn's lightning, as behind the strength of this power was the primordial Lord Soul found at the precipice of the New World. Izalith's daughters during this period were able to channel fire sorcery through the use of catalysts, something evidenced during the canonical first cutscene of Dark Souls 1. However, following the mutation of Izalith, the art of fire sorcery was lost with the warping of her Lord Soul. In its place was a flame of chaos, and channeling this flame required a very different catalyst. It required the use of direct aspects of the chaos flame in the form of pyromancy flames, and projecting from them the warped strength of Izalith's chaos. We learn Quelana would be responsible for the new art of pyromancy and taught others, notably the great student named Salomon. Salomon would go on to exert these teachings and spread Quelana's new teachings to the wider world, including the Great Swamp, a place that would build their culture around this tradition. From the context granted directly by Quelana in Dark Souls 1, we learn the power of a pyromancer was thus linked intimately with the proximity an individual had with the Chaos Flame and Izalith. This is precisely why the greatest pyromancers were not those who were the most intelligent or faithful in retelling the great stories of other gods as miracles, rather people who had nurtured their own pyromancy flame directly linked to Izalith. Pyromancer Denel is once again a great progression of the story related to Izalith in the first game, harbouring an immensely unique affinity to the source of power that originated the tradition of pyromancy. There are major clues indicating he was one of a few humans inducted into Izalithian society during its significant position in the world. Our biggest clue as to Denel's origins laying within Izalith is the description of the unique spell known as Floating Chaos. It tells us Denel was fascinated by the spells employed by the clerics of the Smouldering Lake. His unique harnessing of this ability would suggest a degree of mutuality between himself and the clerics, and the art taught directly to him from the clerics, or rather from the source of power they used to conjure such a unique pyromancy to begin with. We also know the chaos prefix attached to pyromancies often posit a close affiliation to the primordial power of pyromancy and its proximity to the old fire sorcery of Izalith, further drawing him to the original power of Izalith too. In this, not unlike another human known as Xanthus King Jeremiah, Denel may have been one of a few humans non-prejudiced to the Izalith civilization, drawing away the ideological antagonisms to the region pushed by Gwyn during his prolonged conflict against them. We get further insight into how close Denel was to the civilization when we learn of another incredibly unique item in his repertoire, that being the Chaos Blade. Previously, we have spoken about the nature of the Chaos Blade in Dark Souls 1 being directly affiliated to the transposition of Quelaag's soul, a weapon so powerful in nature that a notable Easterner would travel to Lordran for the acquisition of this weapon alone. However, the description of the Chaos Blade from the third installment suggests this weapon may not be the original Chaos Blade, as it doesn't make reference to Quelaag, rather makes reference to another being, one that was never welcome in this world. This also ties into the final unique aspect of Denel's armory, his pyromancy flame, known only as the Pyromancer's Parting Flame. It reads, "Pyromancy Flame of Denel that attracts echoes of death. When Denel lost his hideous spouse, he gave his own pyromancy flame as an offering, which transformed it into a parting flame." And while hideous as a descriptive term could be used to refer to any demon, the existence of the Chaos Blade would infer that Denel may have been incredibly close to Quelaag's sister, the Fair Lady. Her death would warp his own pyromancy flame and too grant him the soul required to recreate the Chaos Blade from a being that was the direct sister of the being originally accountable to the creation of the first Chaos Blade. To return to the description of the Parting Flame, it tells us it hosts a battle art that is known as a send-off fire, which unleashes the remnants of death and acquires some of its Estus in exchange. Once again drawing the parallel not only to Denel acquiring the Fair Lady's power, but also the battle art directly relating to her role as a firekeeper and the replenishment of Estus. Context from Soul Scholar Loki even draws parallels between the Pyromancy Parting Flame and a real-life ritual which is an honouring tradition for deceased loved ones involving bonfire send-offs for a safe journey into the spirit world. Thus, the naming convention of the Pyromancy Parting Flame associated directly to his own honouring of the Fair Lady in her death, something we know is relevant as we can find the Fair Lady's corpse in the game. The combined relation here builds Denel as not just a successor of Izalith's traditions, but one that holds the direct chaos of one of Izalith's daughters, once responsible for successes in the War of Ancients and even birthing pyromancy itself. Wielding the soul of the Fair Lady in the Chaos Blade and a pyromancy flame linked directly to her life, it's unsurprising the death of the Fair Lady would spiral Denel into the mad spirit form we meet him in. While the Fair Lady was the weakest character in the first game, in many ways Danelle is the raging echoes of the unfair treatment she endured during her time on Earth. We know pyromancy was developed by none other than another daughter of Izalit's clan, Quelana, who of course was the most powerful character in the first video. His proximity to the power related to the Izalit daughters suggests he, more than any other pyromancer in the game, was powerful enough to uphold the legacy more than any other scholar of the tradition, far surpassing Cornyx and landing this prestigious position on the list. As one of the greatest ends to the tradition of the Crestfallen, I present to you all Hawkwood. Hawkwood's story starts before the events related to the Ashen Ones rising from the ashes. We're told his story began with a journey to Farron. Finding himself taken aback by the Great Legion, he would enlist himself to become one of their Great Watchers. We learn the Farron Legion, especially in contemporary times, abide by a heavily imposed hierarchy with distinctions through various fighting styles. However, Hawkwood did not just become a great warrior or sorcerer, he was one of the original warriors to become a Great Watcher, beings that would go on to one day link the First Flame itself. We know Hawkwood was one of this great class of beings modelled from Artorias, as he is the only character that can wield the Farron Greatsword, a weapon that is described as synonymous with the Undead Legion. So synonymous in fact that the only other beings who hold this sword are the bona fide Abyss Watchers themselves, suggesting Hawkwood too was one of such an Abyss Watcher. We learn during his tenure and rise in the Legion, he would face a plethora of horrors as the Abyss Watchers at their heart saw the rise of the Dark as symbolic of the Curse of Hollowing, and thus the death of those associated to the Dark were integral to staving away the curse altogether. This is why the Farron Greatsword has unique strength against Dark Wraiths and other beings of Dark such as Wolnir and even Aldrich too. However, somewhere down the line, Hawkwood, likely from watching his Watcher comrades sacrifice themselves at the First Flame, or even the death toll associated with the Rising Abyss, began to fear for his own mortality, a fear that would absolutely consume Hawkwood, enough so that he would rid of his signature weapons and instead he would adopt a shield. In these moments, Hawkwood would desert the Undead Legion and loathe in his own self-pity, realizing he was not brave enough to continue facing the horrors of the growing abyss, adopting a shield and staying far away from the dark. In Hawkwood's natural life, he would live as this great deserter and face death at a final desperate plea to link the First Flame, which would finally grant him some degree of peace. Peace that was, of course, interrupted by the great tolling of bells, summoning back to life the undead whom were once unfit for linking the First Flame, ready for a second chance. The world was calling for Hawkwood, and Hawkwood arose. Unfortunately, facing his new task, Hawkwood rose not with a new resounding passion for greatness, rather fell deeply back into his crestfallen state, referring to the existing Legion of Farron as nothing but undead who are unfit to even lick the boots of the Lords of Cinder who once linked the First Flame. Of course, we learn this is mere projection, as when he speaks about the Legion, he of course is speaking of himself, something symbolized by his dialogue that tells us, how could anyone think that undead could be so special? I certainly couldn't be. However, once we return to the shrine after having defeated his great fire-linking colleagues, he quickly realizes we, the player, and him aren't too dissimilar. We're both unkindled and failures of a past age, able to rise up again and take down even the great rulers of this world. In this, Hawkwood hands over his shield to Andre and leaves the safe haven of Firelink Shrine. We can meet Hawkwood again if we travel towards the Archdragon Peak through Osiris. On our own journey through here, we can spot his summon signs leading straight to the Archdragon Peak. Hawkwood, having witnessed the fate of even the Lords of Cinder at the hands of an Ashen One, has learned even the great rulers of the world will eventually be brought to an unceremonious death. Instead of cowering at this reality, he was inspired. Not inspired to fight for a world that remembered him as a lord, but inspired to fight for himself. Fight for a life outside the confines of what society believes he should be. He wanted out of the world's binary dialectic. No more heroes and villains, victims and victors. He sought to go beyond. And who else is more beyond the dialectic of life and death than the everlasting dragons themselves? Hawkwood sought dragonhood, and he was going to fight to make sure he either became a dragon or died pursuing not what the world wanted, but what he wanted. He was no longer a crestfallen warrior of the wolf, nor a crestfallen warrior of a cycle that bitterly espouses self-flagellation. He was going to become a dragon or die on the crest of himself. After his journey of self-discovery, we can meet him beside his dead comrades in the Abyss Watcher's room, with one final confrontation. Him against the Ashen One that represented everything he once feared becoming himself. A champion of Ash. In this encounter, he tells us, "I should have known well. I've decided to stop running from my own fate. Loathe me all you like, I shall take what makes you dragon." He tells us he's not going to steal anything from us, rather he will face us, not without a shield, but his true weapon, one that represented bravery rather than cowardice. In this moment, he stands as the true lasting living Abyss Watcher, untainted by the Abyss, and in this moment we face the power of a true Abyss Watcher before the madness of the Abyss, before their sacrifice at the altar of the First Flame. Fighting us with all the caliber of the Abyss Watchers, we battle for dragonhood, representing a transcendence of human fears and the cycle itself. And in the end, after we best him, he doesn't die in self-pity, but dies in assurance and pride. He tells us, "You are a dragon, more dragon than I." Hawkwood is the end of a great story that spanned 3 full games, the story of a great warrior found heartbroken at the perils of the world. His story is their story. No matter how crestfallen you find yourself through the ages, by observing the world unburdened by the social pressures of the world, you will find purpose. Purpose to preserve yourself before anything else. If, like Hawkwood, you are burdened by comparisons, burdened by where everyone else is in their own lives, feeling a failure to those around you, remember, what matters the most at the end of your life is that you fought for yourself. Only you experience your own life, and it's important you carry yourself with kindness and patience, but also inspired ambition to fulfill your own life with happiness and pride in the things you enjoy. Not what others think you should enjoy. And even if you never materialize your great ambitions, give yourself a try. The crestfallen warrior from Dark Souls 1 taught us of finding joy in humour and relationships with those around us. The crestfallen knight from Dark Souls 2 taught us patience and acceptance, not just with ourselves, but with those around us. And Hawkwood teaches us self-growth, void of the validation we think we need to lead fulfilled lives. A great study on the thoughts of those on their deathbed found the most common regret was spending far too much time of their lives working for employers and organisations that will continue with or without them. And the most common pride they had at the end of their lives weren't their status or wealth, it was actualising themselves through hobbies and interests they loved with people that truly mattered to them. With that being said, the great Hawkwood, Abyss Legionnaire, Challenger to Dragonhood, Crestfallen Warrior ranks here on the list. What even is a crest when you are gone, but a reminder that society outlives us all and the insignificance of individual sacrifice. The Sable Church, and thus Uria, represent the combined aspects of all antithetical forces against the Age of Fire, more specifically the combined aspects of all revolutions birthed from humanity and the dark. We're told Uria is one of the 3 sisters that would develop the Sable Church from the power of their swordsmanship alone. We know the Age of Fire is incredibly heavy-handed with hollows, let alone the construction of a state exclusive to hollows. So it's no surprise the Black Set describes their ability to construct the Sable Church as accountable to how powerful they actually were. Yuria in particular was even more powerful as she uniquely wielded the Dark Drift. In the previous video we discussed how the Dark Drift is outright described as a weapon devised by Nito, a weapon that existed in two planes, the one of souls and the material realm too, giving it a uniquely powerful position amongst other weapons. So great was this weapon, Grave Warden Ogdane was the only other being commemorated with the blade, and his position of authority represented by the blade too. How Yuria gained this blade is hard to tell, but the description of the blade does tell us cursed sword with an unseen blade, choice weapon of Yuria. Yuria, mentor of the Sable Church and accomplished swordswoman, is said to have claimed 100 lives with this weapon. However, Yuria's power was not just based on her ability as a swordswoman, as she also represented the power of many historical revolutionary forces too. The first element of power harnessed by the Sable Church and thus Yuria were that of the Dark Sigils. So what are Dark Sigils? First, we have to go back to the story of a being named Karth. Karth was a primordial serpent adjacent to the same framework associated to the everlasting dragons. Primordial serpents weren't materially connected to the primary dialectic between the Dark Soul and the Age of Fire, and thus they did not have an inherent allegiance to either cause. However, primordial serpents, as their name would suggest, would exist from the inception of the world and thus held knowledge of its true events from memory alone. And while the serpents, as mentioned, were not materially connected to the dialectic, they did offer a historical narration on the dialectic of the world. Most of you are familiar with a primordial serpent known as Frampt, the joyous serpent in the Firelink Shrine that narrates the history of the world as we've come to know it from mostly secondary narrative context provided in the game, uplifting Gwyn's actions and pushing the linkage of the First Flame as the correct and moral decision for any chosen undead. However, we can meet another primordial serpent named Karth. Karth instead represents history as told from the perspective of humans, renouncing Gwyn's propaganda as intentionally misleading and hiding the truth that Gwyn was a tyrant who feared the Dark Soul and the power humans innately had. However, we're far from the first person he tells this to, as we learn his first action in undoing Gwyn's Age of Fire was revealing the truth about the Dark Sign and Gwyn's role in subjugating the pygmy children of Manus to Manus himself. The furtive pygmy laying dormant below the lands of Ulasil, likely awaiting the natural end to the Age of Fire, is awoken by Karth and informed of Gwyn's betrayal and the curse Gwyn tricked his beloved children into accepting. Infuriated at this discovery, the furtive pygmy would take the form known as Manus, an enraged aspect of humanity itself. Of course, we know eventually Manus would come to an end thanks to an unnamed hero, but his soul would canonically shatter into tiny fragments across the world. In Dark Souls 2, some of these fragments turn into the Four Dark Sisters, incredibly powerful in their own right and influential enough to usurp their respective kingdoms all on their own. We also learn in Dark Souls 3 the fragments of Manus are what we later understand as Dark Sigils, something used to deepen the state of hollowing for all residents and bring them to a truer, darker form reminiscent of their pygmy ancestors, able to retain their individuality despite the confines of the Dark Sign, something we ourselves can indulge in within the game too. The next aspect of power harnessed by the Sable Church was the art of life drain. After the events of Manus' failure, Karth would move on to New Londo, a realm that had 4 great kings of pygmy descendancy granted a portion of Gwyn's soul for their help during the War of Ancients. Karth, in a similar fashion, would enlighten the 4 kings of their own nature and grant them the art of life drain, a power that allowed them to steal humanity, galvanize it within themselves, and militarize it against the Age of Fire. New Londo would begin to build an army of warriors for this new mission under the Dark Wraith Covenant, only for Gwyn to hear of this secret rebellion and preemptively flood New Londo, fearing the power of life drain and its potential ability to undo the Age of Fire even during its height of power. The art of life drain would have a variety of reoccurrences in the game, and we even find it in Dark Souls 2 as a spell found deep in the depths of the abyss. We know the Sable Church would harness this too, as even if the Art of Life Drain in its pure Dark Hand form was lost in Dark Souls 2, the Sable Church and Yuria were able to bring it back to life in the final installment. The description of the Dark Hand in Dark Souls 3 tells us, weapon that allows its wielder to evoke an art unique to Londor, the Land of Hollows. It is also said to be an ancient relic of a primordial serpent. Taking us to the next aspect of power harnessed by the Sable Church, this being the tradition of hexes and dark sorcery. Dark sorcery was first introduced in the game through Manus' awakening. His raging primordial dark soul corrupted Ulasil, turning the once peaceful mystics into warlocks, able to project the power of humanity itself. Of course, we know humanity is just another name for the dark soul, and we learn sorcery as a tradition is underpinned by the projection of souls through a catalyst. The undoing of Ulasil would have caused dark sorcery to be lost if it wasn't for a single human named Galea, who would spread the gospel of dark sorcery to the wider world as hexes. The hexing tradition would become incredibly influential in Dark Souls 2, but one man would take hexes further than anyone else. This, of course, being Navlan, a necromancer who in his rebirth became in himself an aspect of dark sorcery, able to catalyze spells from his bare hands. A story we went into in more detail in the Dark Souls 2 video. We know the Sable Church and thus Yuria adopted this power through the spell known as Dead Again. It tells us sacrilegious miracle of the Sable Church. Something curious as we know its origins relate it to Dark Souls 2 and likely the concoction of Navlan himself. Taking us to the final aspect of historical power harnessed by the Sable Church, this being Velka's miracles. Well, Velka is not inherently tied to the Dark Soul and is actually juxtaposingly tied to the godhood associated to Anor Londo. We know she would abandon Gwyn's bureaucracy, sensing the sin Gwyn committed in linking the First Flame, and instead took on a godmother role for all of those who were victims of Gwyn's actions, taking residence in Gwyn's dumping grounds known as the Painted World. Within the Painted World, Velka would be accountable for bringing an element of power known as the occult, an aspect of power directly related to slaying gods. We know the Sable Church were able to harness this power as they have adopted the spell known as the Vow of Silence, its description telling us directly of how the Sable Church reappropriated this power for themselves in the contemporary world. With all this being said, it's not surprising that Yuria, one of the 3 founding members of the Sable Church and seemingly most prominent of the 3, would represent one of the most impactful endings in the series. Wielding the Dark Drift, she is described as an incredibly powerful swordswoman, and just between the 3 sisters, they were able to construct Londor and galvanize a variety of historically antithetical powers, formalizing a new kingdom of hollows and a formal opposition to the Age of Fire. It's not surprising Karth himself co-signed the Sable Church as his primary mode to undo the Age of Fire once again, often reserving himself only to the most powerful antithetical elements. As a final note, we know Elfrida, Yuria's elder sister, once attempted to usurp the First Flame, but failed to do so at the final hurdle. And while we don't know for certain if Yuria was greater than Elfrida, we do know the sisters sat very closely adjacent to each other in power, adding more context to Yuria's strength. Ultimately, Yuria represented all of the historical powers associated to the dark revolutions snuffed out by the Age of Fire. She combined them to stand as one of the most important bastions of a new age during the time of the Unkindling. We know other varieties of the revolutionary aspects of the Dark would also emerge, most notably that of the Deep and the influence of Sullivan that was admittedly much more potent. But with our help, it's the Sable Church's goals that can potentially be formalized in an alternative ending of the game that seems to break the cycle and begin for the first time an Age of Hollows through the use of the Dark Sigils and Manus' fragmented power. In this, Yuria representing the Sable Church in contemporary times ranks this high on the list. Carla is a great character on this list, as she not only spiritually brings to life one of the series' most beloved characters, but is also incredibly pleasant as an NPC, and holds within her power far greater than what would originally be assumed on first impressions. As mentioned in Alva's entry, Carla likely lineates from Zully, a witch that was once set to trick the knight Alva and lead him astray from a holy mission. Zully and Alva would eventually come to respect one another, and their respect would turn to adoration. Adoration turned to love. A love that would both reframe their purposes, but also cause them to abandon their ordained duties, pursuing this love above all else. Our first clue as to Carla's association to Zully comes from her aesthetic similarities. The armour associated with Zully is almost identical to Carla's attire. Her hat even tells us Hat of the Dark Witch, Carla. A pointed hat is the signature of a heretical sorceress. Carla, however, always kept it close. We know Zully was often considered heretical by the prevailing narrative of Dark Souls 2, and the description even suggests this hat was exclusively worn by this so-called heretical sorcerer, going on to tell us Carla also always kept it close to her through the ages, drawing this comparison even closer. We aren't told a lot about Zully as a powerful force in the game, but description has always put Zully adjacent to characters such as the Dark Sisters, related to Nashandra and Manus. Naturally, Zully's original goal was eerily similar to the fragments of Manus that would become the Dark Sisters in Dark Souls 2, as she, much like Nashandra, Nadalia, Elsana and Alana, all would seek strength through manipulation of a powerful soul. For Zully, this was evidently Alva. Naturally, Carla would carry this mantra and hold within her some of the most potent projections of dark sorcery in the entire game. We get insight into this through the initial spells she can teach us, the first being Affinity. Affinity as a spell in Dark Souls 1 was known as the Pursuers. We learn from Dark Souls 1 the only way of obtaining the spell was through the soul of Manus himself. The Pursuer's description in Dark Souls 1 tells us, "Sorcery of Manus. The will feels envy or perhaps love, and despite the inevitable trite and tragic ending, the will sees no alternative." We learn the description of the spell Affinity almost word for word echoes the sentiment originally described in the Pursuer's spell from Manus' soul. Its description reads, "A forbidden dark sorcery. It appears to be an expression of envy or perhaps love towards another that will tenaciously pursue its target," making the parallel much clearer. This also adds further context to Carla's dark sorcery being unrelated to the derived spellcasting traditions of Galea and Hexes, but rather deeply set within the primordial powers once erupted in Ulasil through Manus' rage, a rage that would bring to life sprites of humanity eerily resembling the spell itself, suggesting Carla's power is a raw extension of Manus in a similar sense to Nashandra and her contemporaries. Powers so great even Vendrick could not subvert its corrupting presence. The other spell she can teach us is known as the Dark Edge. We know the first introduction of this spell is through Dark Souls 2 and Carillion's expedition into Nadalia's territory. We ourselves can also obtain this spell through Shulva and Elana's kingdom, once again drawing the power between Carla adjacent to the ever so powerful fragments of Manus from the second installment of the game. Carla, even in her default spells, is without a doubt one of the rawest expressions of dark sorcery in Dark Souls 3. She is a figment of Manus in a game far after his death. But sorcery wasn't Carla's only calling, as we learn from Quelana's tome that Carla may have also embedded herself as a masterful pyromancer too. The tome's description tells us, "This tome can only be taught by a female master," something further reinforced by the fact that Cornix, our resident pyromancer, is entirely unable to teach us its contents as it exceeds him in knowledge, and only Carla can. We also know Quelana's pyromancy may have been one of the most proficient in the entire series, as she alone may be attributable to the widespread art of pyromancy and the conversion of fire sorcery into the accessible art of pyromancy after Izalith's mutation, suggesting that Carla may not only be a master pyromancer, but also reminiscent of the great daughters of Izalith too. We aren't told exactly how she became so proficient in pyromancy, but we do know the witch traditions associated to sorcery were often unorthodox, and it wouldn't be a stretch for witches to look upon the daughters of Izalith as powerful female role models. Our other notable tome we can give Carla ties everything all together. The Grave Warden tome is described as Wolnir's final contribution to pyromancy. Wolnir was once a great ruler of Karthus and a notoriously powerful leader too. His reign is often touted as the most expansive in the entire game, becoming a High Lord of many lands thanks to Karthus's successful and belligerent campaign to unify the kingdoms. We know Wolnir would meet his demise after being consumed by the Abyss in an attempt to secure his own immortality, but at the cusp of his demise would formulate dark pyromancy, flames that harboured powers of the Abyss, a unique blend of dark sorcery and pyromancy. Naturally, Carla is the only person able to decipher these texts, as who else was not only directly linked to the furtive pygmy in Manus, but also pyromancy inspired by the witches of Izalith too. It's a combination of all of these things that actually paint Carla as an extension of the greatest aspect of the Dark Soul itself through her affiliations with Manus and the Dark Sisters of Dark Souls 2, but also more than likely the most proficient pyromancer in the entire game. When we combine this with the fact that she is not only able to independently stand tall in both disciplines, but also make use of those masteries in a unique form herself, she soars far above a great majority of other characters on this list, placing her here. Amongst everything, we learn Shira represents not just the primary dialectic in Dark Souls 1, but also the premise of the old order of gods altogether. Naturally, Shira's heritage can thus be found at the precipice of the War of Ancients. Her armory tells the story of a Silver Knight who went beyond her duty as a protector of Anor Londo and a foot soldier to Gwyn. We learn from her crown, but also her armour, that behind the elegance of the fabric is silver. Similarly, her weapon, the Crucifix of the Mad King, is described as once being a cross spear. Naturally, cross spears such as that of Ornstein's were the choice weapon used by Silver Knights during the War of Ancients. Ornstein's weaponry describing this type of spear as particularly good at piercing hide and reminiscent of Gwyn's lightning that first undid the everlasting dragon. We get more context as to how powerful Shira was during her premiership as an ancient dragon slayer, as the description of the lightning arrow spell tells us of her distinction as a dragon slayer who was, for one, a woman, but also powerful enough to conjure this miracle that is stated to offer a great improvement over the typical armory utilized by the Silver Knights. We also learn from her armour that Shira's veins course with royal blood. As her timeline puts her at the beginning of the world, this would indicate she was a god in a similar sense to Artorias, Ornstein and even Kiran. Of course, we learned from Kiran in the Dark Souls 1 video that godhood and royalty were synonymous in Lordran. However, her godhood, while certain, may be of a very different nature to those assumed for characters such as Kiran. Our first clue is in her title. We learn she is known within the game as the daughter of the Duke. Something curious, as the only being that took the title Duke in the royal family was of course Seath the Scaleless. We get more context through her dialogue, or more specifically her battle cry. In this, she proclaims her status as the child of both a god and a duke. While it's still speculation as to whom Duke Seath would have a child with, or the dynamics of exactly how this worked, we do know Shira isn't just a child of Seath's self-reproduction, even though it's entirely plausible Seath's contemporary form in Anor Londo hosted a portion of Gwyn's own soul and could theoretically be enough to solely birth a royal heir based on just this. Some naturally theorise the child was between Seath and Guinevere, but this remains speculative. Nevertheless, we know at the very minimum Shira was born of Seath, a primordial dragon that was also hosting within himself a portion of Gwyn's soul, making her in a small way adjacent to Gwyn's true children, such as that of the immensely powerful Gwyndolin. Of course, this may seem to contradict Shira's presence as a cross-spear-wielding warrior of the War of Ancients. However, we do learn from the first installment that the War of Ancients wasn't just a one-time primordial conflict, rather spanned throughout a great period of time, even after the creation of Anor Londo and Seat's possession of Gwyn's soul, meaning Shira, although born after the main events of the War of Ancients, was still able to build herself as a champion dragonslayer amongst those who were there during the first moments of the conflict. However, despite such great achievements during the First Age, we learn her greatest achievement would come after the creation of the Ring City. We learn from the final installments the Dark Sign was not forced onto humans, rather Gwyn manipulated the primordial human lords, known as Pygmy Lords, into accepting the sign for positions of authority under the Age of Fire. It's clear the Pygmy Lords had little knowledge of the nature of their own humanity and accepted the Dark Sign as a pledge to their presiding ruler, Gwyn. Of course, we learn the Dark Sign did naught but contradictorily confine their humanity to the Age of Fire, making it materially difficult for their humanity to enact its true revolution at the precipice of the natural dialectic between the Age of Fire and the ordained coming Age of Dark, which of course is the premise for the game itself. However, amongst their ranks we learn one certain Pygmy Lord, later referred to as the Mad King, would have his humanity begin to run wild and contest the very shackles of the Dark Sign, causing him to become delirious in a hollow-like form, but with the power of a being tied directly to the primordial power of the Dark Soul itself. In this, we are given images of Manus, of course not to the power of Manus, as Manus was not bound by the Dark Sign, but still incredibly powerful. As we learn, even amongst the Pygmy Lords lay a great portion of the power associated with the Dark Soul itself. This is why Gale, at the end of the world, hunts the Pygmy Lords to consolidate the Dark Soul. To return to the Mad King, we learn the Ring City quickly reacted to one of their presiding lords turning towards an aspect of himself that was feared so deeply by Gwyn, and it would be Shira that would take it upon herself to turn all of her royal powers against him, eventually coming out on top and impaling him with her cross spear. Of course, we know the crossbeam was built for killing dragons, not humans, and thus the Mad King never truly did die, rather became permanently emaciated on her spear. Shira, a proud member of Gwyn's First Order, would then make it her sole purpose to ensure the Mad King would never leave, locking herself away with the Pygmy Lord on her spear, exactly where we meet her in the game. During her solitude, she can recruit us to the ranks of the Spear of the Church, indicating her role also sat firmly within the protection of Filianor's Rest. She even disperses exposition of Medea, calling him a friend of hers, naturally drawing back her heritage as an ancient dragon too. It's no surprise that at the end of the world, three beings still exist: you, Gale, and Shira. This is intentional. This is the moment the dialectic of the world, the thesis of the Age of Fire, the antithesis of the Dark, and the synthesizing material conditions all face off, not as convoluted bureaucracies, rather symbolized in three separate individuals. Gale represents the plight of humanity. He is at this point the aspect of the Dark Soul, raging for the final time as a force of nature, correcting Gwyn's contradictions. Shira, on the other hand, is the final remnant of the Age of Fire, the thesis of the world still desperately clawing to maintain the oppressive hegemonic order. She proclaims her place self-righteously, vows to punish us, and even at the end of the world, with her authority in ruins, still seeks to humiliate the nature of the dark. We, on the other hand, are the synthesizing material force, witnessing the end of the world, and by killing Shira and consolidating Gale into ourselves, synthesize a new world within ourselves. Shira is without a doubt one of the most powerful NPCs in the game. Who else would stand the tallest than the facsimile of Gwyn's Age of Fire, but also a reminder of the revolution Gwyn had to enact to build his Age of Fire, as her heritage is tied to the dragons and the War of Ancients. In a funny way, us assimilating the Dark Soul by killing Gale and ending the Age of Fire after killing Shira makes us not too dissimilar to Gwyn himself. We are now an embodiment of the turning ages and a pioneer for a new age entirely. I want to start this entry with a question. What is the Dark Soul? Well, now at the end of the world, we have a material answer. It is the fourth soul found at the precipice of the changing world. One that was inherently different to the other fiery Lord Souls. One that was taken a hold of by a lowly, quiet being below, later known only as the furtive pygmy. The term furtive relates to the action of avoiding attention. It's often associated with someone who finds something special and believes it must hide this precious something to avoid trouble. Similarly, the term pygmy is reference to a being small or smaller than their contemporaries. The furtive pygmy, empowered by this newfound strength, much like Gwyn, saw a future bound to its presence, a quiet and peaceful future of beings later known as pygmies, and thus pygmy lords and the forefathers to humans. All beings born of the furtive pygmy were of his soul, the Dark Soul, a dialectical opposite to the fiery Lord Souls. It wasn't prideful or belligerent, it was quiet and deep. Deep like the sea. And just like the sea, it consumed like a cosmically heavy weight, entirely gravitational, a force of nature, a pending singularity, supposed great equalizer for all beings. On the other side of the aisle was fire, the total opposite. Fire was not gravitational, it was loud and forceful, it pushed without restraint. Fire changed the world because the world was in a Rousseauian state of nature, waiting for a dialectic to emerge to conceptualize a social apparatus, authorized by a antithetical hegemon. That's a mouthful, but I want to ground this in real-world philosophical concepts because Patches is so much more than just a character. He is a force of nature. With the advent of Gwyn's Age of Fire and the destruction of the everlasting dragons, Gwyn had dibs on setting society's structures, building a hierarchy of deities, lords, and peasantry. Or in other words, humans. This hierarchy was present because Gwyn, more than anybody else, knew ages were susceptible to revolutionary shifts, because remember, he was once upon a time the vanguard of his own revolution. And this is also when we learn why the furtive pygmy was so furtive, because he likely knew the Dark Soul had within it the power to overthrow Gwyn, but only once the Age of Fire inevitably dimmed due to its own material contradictions. So the furtive pygmy waited for his time to emerge a new world, one that empowered a new class of beings that were inevitably second-class citizens in Gwyn's Age of Fire and royal family. He tolerated the Age of Fire because he knew the future held a more equal world, an age of the Dark Soul, an age for humans to rise to the heights of their former lords. But of course, we learn Gwyn saw this, and thus took desperate measures to preserve the contradictions of the Age of Fire by bribing the Pygmy Lords with positions of authority in exchange for the Dark Sign, a permanent indelible mark on their humanity itself, forcing nature's stagnation. Eventually Gwyn would immolate himself to preserve his age further. These actions later canonized by Aldir as the first sin, a slight against nature itself, a betrayal of the same natural turning of ages that Gwyn once benefited from himself. From this point, a brutal dialectic would emerge within the perpetually contradictory cycle of the Age of Fire, where the Dark would stop waiting as nature was no longer able to help them, forcing them to bring the rightful turning of ages into their own hands. The furtive pygmy, informed by Karth of this treachery, would be first, raging without cohesion at the betrayal of Gwyn. Later, the four kings of Gwyn's own realm, would also join the rage. But after the first bursts of anger came the quiet revolutions. That of the Dark Wraiths after New Londo's drowning, the Church of the Deep, Sullivan, and most importantly Londor, a self-proclaimed self-righteous religion moralizing a new age of the Dark Soul, an age of hollows. I've spoken a lot about the nature of the world because up to this point many would now come to the realization that the Age of Fire, the thesis of the current unjust world of Dark Souls, was morally bad, and the Dark Soul, the soul of humanity, was a perfect antithesis and thus by its conceptual end morally good. But is it really? Thankfully, that's not a question you have to answer, because that's what Patches is here for. Through the game, Patches tests humanity. If humanity and those born purely of the Dark Soul are made of the stuff that will encourage a peaceful new world, void of Gwyn's selfishness, surely humans therefore have to be inherently good and receptive to equality. I don't want to spoil Patches' research, but the truth is humans aren't that. Patches exist not only to test this, but to show us that moralizing our actions, even if we are acting as a saviour of nature's course by promoting the Age of Dark, is no different to the powers that once influenced Gwyn to act out the first sin. Patches tests us throughout the series by poking and prodding at our nature until we turn and show our anger and vitriol. He betrays our trust and then asks for our forgiveness time and time again because he wants to know, are humans any different than the deities that oppress them? Are humans just a string of events away from acting in anger, desperation, not unlike Gwyn? Patches asks if society did progress to the Age of Dark, a true age that superseded the Age of Fire, would we actually be living in equality and peace? Patches is not a character that is influencing the world. He's not changing endings or killing deities, challenging great establishments or changing the course of history. In fact, Patches is not here to be present in the game's universe. He's here to be present with us. Not our character, but the person who sits behind the screen. You. Patches, by poking us, forces us to show the nature of our own humanity. How many of you killed Patches after he betrayed you when you played the first game in a blind playthrough? A lot of you, I'm sure. How many more of you replayed the game and killed Patches before he could characteristically push you off the ledge? I know I did. How many more of you are immediately distrustful of Patches when he shows up in games such as Elden Ring and Bloodborne? All of us, really. Patches shows us we are distrusting beings. We can barely extend trust and forgiveness to our own kind. Then how can we judge Gwyn being distrustful of beings that were, just like Patches is to us, inherently opposed to our interest? We judge Gwyn because he did everything to stave off the Age of Dark, because the Age of Dark meant the end of his own era, the end of his own life. We kill and distrust Patches when we start new playthroughs because we already know he represents potential death and hardship to our character, even before he's able to act on it. Greyrat is a character we skimmed over near the earlier portion of this video, and incidentally, Greyrat is massively relevant to understanding Patches. Never in the entire series are we able to witness Patches being sincere about any other character, but he is for Greyrat, and thus we have to ask ourselves why this is. Well, it's because Greyrat represents everything the Dark Soul was supposed to represent, a truly selfless being, a comrade to his peers, a quiet and secretive being just waiting for their turn, but giving everything to aid their close friends and strangers alike, just like the furtive pygmy during the Age of Ancients, offering his own men to Gwyn to battle the everlasting dragons even if he had nothing to gain. We learn Greyrat aided Patches in Lothric Dungeon for nothing in return. Patches tells us he did me a good turn back in Lothric Dungeon. Doubtless I should do something about that little debt. And for the first time, Patches does honour a debt, returning the favour and saving Greyrat while hiding behind the armour of Sigurd. At the end of the world, Gale represents the Dark Soul. Gale is not a human of nobility, the church, or even a chosen undead. He's not a ruler or famous mage or sorcerer, he's not a scholar or a fragment of Manus. He's nothing but a slave, much like Greyrat, hunched, secretive, quiet, and waiting. At the end of the world, Patches is known as Lap. A stint of amnesia afflicts Patches and we follow him through the end of the world. Once brought back to clarity, he betrays us again. Every age, it seems, is tainted by the greed of men.
Rubbish to one such as I, devoid of all worldly wants. I don't know. Maybe it's just the way we are. I'll stick you in my prayers. A fine dark soul to you.
Patches knew if the Age of Fire was to end, it would be done only by a true image of the Dark Soul. He didn't find it in nobles, warriors, philosophers, heroes, or chosen humans, and running out of time, he eventually found it in a slave. And in the end of the world, it's a slave that purges the world of its greed. It's a slave that sacrificed everything, protecting and working for others for nothing in return, that shows what humanity is and what humanity is supposed to be. Small and quiet, and to this we all return. Thank you so much for making it to the end of the video. We've finally come to the end of the Dark Souls characters ranked by lore, and I adore everyone who cheered me on as I took on this gargantuan task. Truth is, I love writing these videos, so thank you so much for allowing me to live out my hobby. Please do feel free to subscribe and like the video. I rely entirely on organic growth and am a one-man army when it comes to my videos. Our real world is both figuratively and literally on fire right now, and I hope I'm able to grant you all a place of proper escape. I'll continue doing this because I love the community we are building, and I think we are genuinely building something quite special. Until the next video, I'll see you all very, very soon.